Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on a journey, not just through space, but through time. Close your eyes for a moment if you feel comfortable doing that, and imagine the vast high plains of Ethiopia. Feel the dry air, maybe catch the faint scent of dust carried on a breeze that has swept over mountains and valleys that have seen, well, everything. Imagine the silence stretching out under an immense star-dusted sky, a silence broken only by the distant call of a night bird or the rustle of unseen creatures in the thorny scrub. You're standing on ground that has been trod for millennia, layers upon layers of human history packed beneath your feet like a forgotten dusty scroll. We're going deep tonight into the quiet corners, where the echoes of ancient power have faded to whispers. Let's be honest, this isn't the flashy, easily digestible history you might find elsewhere. This is the kind of history that sleeps under rocks, waits in unmarked graves, and requires a certain patience to uncover. In fact, you probably won't survive this without drifting off at least once, which of course is the whole point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always cool to see how far these whispers travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the stillness. It's the silence of deep history, the kind that settles on places that have seen empires rise and fall often, without leaving much more than scattered pottery shards or overgrown mounds. Ethiopia. This ancient land holds secrets tightly, especially when it comes to its earliest rulers. Forget the famous names you might dimly recall from a history class you probably snoozed through. We're going further back to the kings and leaders, whose existence is sometimes debated, whose tombs are theoretical, and whose power dissolved into the same earth from which it rose. You're walking on that earth now, feeling its weight, its density, the accumulation of epochs. It's a place where time feels different, less like a ticking clock, and more like geological layers. Think about the sheer depth of time here. While we often talk about Rome or Greece and feel like that's ancient, Ethiopia has a lineage that stretches back far, far earlier, not just in terms of human origins, which you know are famously very old here, but in terms of complex societies starting to coalesce. Long before anything recognizable as the famed Aksumite kingdom, there were people, communities, hierarchies. There were certainly leaders, chiefs, elders, perhaps even proto-kings ruling over smaller areas. Their names are lost to us, buried not just under soil, but under the weight of millennia without written records. You're trying to listen for their echoes, a faint rustle in the dry grass, the whisper of a name the wind might carry if you were patient enough and perhaps slightly delusional. Imagine standing on a plateau in the northern highlands. The wind whips around you carrying grit that might literally be ground up pottery from 1,000 years ago or more. You look out over a landscape of rugged mountains and deep valleys. This wasn't an easy place to forge a kingdom. Communication was difficult, travel was arduous, and every community likely had its own way of doing things. Yet somehow the seeds of more organized power structures were planted. You can almost feel the energy of that early organization, the collective effort to build a well, to clear land for crops, to defend against rivals. And with organization comes leadership. Someone had to be in charge, someone whose word carried weight, someone who maybe, just maybe, was treated differently, even in death. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of complex social organization in the northern Ethiopian highlands were truly states, or more like powerful chiefdoms or confederations. This debate highlights how hazy the picture is before the emergence of clearer entities like the Dem Kingdom. It's like trying to see details through a thick fog. You know something is there, shapes emerge, but you can't be sure of the exact form or scale. You squint through this historical fog trying to discern the outlines of those first significant leaders. Were they chosen? Did they seize power? Did they claim divine right from the get-go? Or was that a later invention? These are the questions that linger in the dusty air. One mainstream historical fact we can grasp onto is that by the first millennium BCE, there's archaeological evidence pointing towards increasingly sophisticated societies in this region, particularly in areas that would later become the core of the Aksumite kingdom. This includes things like larger settlements, more complex irrigation systems, and evidence of trade networks. These weren't just scattered villages anymore. they were becoming something more. Someone was coordinating the digging of those irrigation channels. Someone was deciding who traded what and where. That someone was likely a leader and likely one of the earliest predecessors to the kings we'll discuss. Now for a quirky tidbit, before grand tombs or stelae, how were these early leaders buried? Archaeology suggests a variety of practices from simple pit graves to slightly more elaborate earth mounds or stone cairns. Sometimes these early burials included grave goods, pottery, simple tools, maybe personal ornaments. What's interesting is that differentiating a chief's grave from a wealthy individual's grave from this period can be incredibly difficult based only on the burial itself. It's not like they had little name tags that survived the millennia. So while we know burials were happening, pinpointing which ones belong to the top dogs of these earliest societies is often pure speculation based on context or associated findings like being located centrally in a settlement. Imagine trying to figure out who was the boss of your town 3,000 years from now just by digging up the old cemetery. It's a bit like that, but with much less data and absolutely zero tiny plastic skeletons left over from Halloween decorations. You continue your walk through this imagined ancient landscape. The sun is starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows. The air cools and the silence deepens, broken only by the crunch of your boots on the dry soil. You're surrounded by the unseen presence of those who came before. The very ground you stand on holds the dust of their lives, their struggles, and yes, their deaths. And among those deaths lost in the earth are the final resting places of individuals who held power when the world was young in this corner of Africa. They are the truly forgotten kings, the pre-dawn rulers whose existence is inferred more than documented. We're going to try and listen very, very carefully for their whispers tonight. You're still standing there feeling the ancient dust settle on your shoes, maybe catching a bit of it on your tongue if the wind picks up. We've peered into the deepest fog, the time before written history, before even clear archaeological markers of rulership. Now the fog thins just a little. We're moving forward a few centuries perhaps, landing somewhere around the 8th century BCE. This is where we start to see the first whispers of a larger political entity in the northern highlands. The Kingdom of Demt, sometimes called Da'amat. Say that name quietly, Demt. It sounds a bit like a cough, doesn't it? Very appropriate for something so ancient and half-forgotten. This wasn't yet Aksum, the later more famous kingdom. Damt was its predecessor, a kingdom centered around what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Imagine arriving here, not in the modern era, but 2,500 years ago. The landscape would look somewhat similar, rugged and majestic, but the human footprint would be different. You'd see evidence of settled agriculture, maybe larger villages, and increasingly structures that suggest a level of organization beyond just a few families banding together. You might notice larger stone buildings, perhaps fortifications, and definitely sites that look like they were used for religious or communal purposes. Dimti is often described as a kingdom, but our understanding of its rulers, its structure, and frankly, its entire vibe is piecemeal. We don't have long king lists etched on temple walls like in Egypt. We don't have detailed chronicles. What we have are archaeology, a few inscriptions, and a lot of educated guesswork. It's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with 95% of the pieces missing, and the remaining 5% are covered in dirt and bite marks. You can sort of see a corner here and edge there, but the full picture, good luck with that. The DMT kingdom is particularly interesting because of its apparent connections to South Arabia across the Red Sea. You might see architectural styles that remind you of Sabaean kingdoms, like the one ruled by the Queen of Sheba, though that's a whole other, even more debated topic we won't touch with a 10-foot pole right now because sleep. You might find inscriptions in South Arabian script. This led early scholars to believe Damt was a South Arabian colony. You can almost hear the academic arguments echoing over the dusty plains. Colony. No indigenous development with influence. But the inscriptions, linguistic borrowing. Honestly, if you listen closely, the sound of academics debating ancient history is probably more effective than any lullaby. Imagine a ruler of Damt. What were they like? We have a few names from inscriptions, individuals who use titles like Mukarib, which is also a title used in South Arabia, often translated as something like unifier or federator. Names like Wernhu Urdum Arbia LMMN. Try saying those 5 times fast before you fall asleep. LMN is the most well-known primarily because his name appears on several inscriptions, including one at the major DMT site of Yeha. You're standing near Yeha now in your imagination. It's famous for its impressive still-standing temple, a large stone structure that feels ancient in a way that gets right into your bones. This temple, dedicated to the South Arabian moon god Al-Makka, is a tangible link to the religious practices and influences of the time. Was LMN the king who oversaw its construction or expansion? Possibly. Was he a powerful figure? Given the scale of the architecture and the inscriptions, it seems likely. But beyond that, crickets. Historical crickets, the quietest kind. Think about the life of King LMN, or whoever the ruler was, at Yeha. They probably oversaw agricultural cycles, managed trade routes, controlled access to the Red Sea coast, and perhaps led military campaigns against rival groups. They would have presided over religious ceremonies at places like the Temple of Al-Makka. But what did they feel? Were they burdened by responsibility, or did they enjoy the power? Did they have a favorite camel? Did they snore? These are the truly vital historical questions that will likely remain unanswered forever, which, fine by me, fewer things to remember. One mainstream historical fact about DMT is that its existence is primarily attested through archaeological evidence and a limited number of inscriptions found in the region, particularly around Yeha and Kaskasi in Eritrea. This period represents a significant step up in complexity from the earlier chiefdoms, showing evidence of centralized authority capable of mobilizing labor for large construction projects like temples and possibly irrigation works. You can still visit the ruins at Yeha today if you're ever in northern Ethiopia and fancy feeling incredibly small and insignificant next to a very old wall. It's a surprisingly effective ego check. Now for a quirky tidbit about DMT, some of the inscriptions from DMT sites mention the use of altars for offerings and sacrifices. What's particularly intriguing is that these inscriptions sometimes refer to specific types of offerings, like frankincense and myrrh, which were valuable commodities traded in the region. But they also mention animal sacrifices. While animal sacrifice is common in ancient religions, the details sometimes hinted at in the fragmented texts or depicted on artifacts can be, well, let's just say it wasn't like offering a nice fruit basket. Imagine the scene at the Temple of Al-Makka, the air thick with the smoke of incense and something else less pleasant. It gives you a very grounded and perhaps slightly unsettling sense of their religious practices. It makes you appreciate the fact that your worst offering faux pas today is probably bringing the wrong kind of dip to a party. Historians still argue whether the kingdom of DMT was a direct ancestor of the later Aksumite kingdom, or if there was a significant period of decline and fragmentation between the two. Did Aksum rise directly from DMT's ashes, or did DMT collapse, leaving a power vacuum that Aksum eventually filled centuries later? The archaeological record isn't perfectly clear on this transition, leaving room for scholarly debate and ensuring that perfectly good sleep is interrupted by thoughts of ancient political continuity. Oh, the glamour of history. You continue wandering through the spectral landscape of DMT. You pass ghostly villages, fields where ancient crops grew, and perhaps catch a glimpse of that impressive temple at Yeha, standing silent against the sky. The rulers of this kingdom, the Makarabs, like LMN, were likely buried. But where did they have monumental tombs, or were they laid to rest in ways that are harder to distinguish from those they ruled? Given the limited evidence, it's likely their tombs, if they were distinct at all, haven't been clearly identified or have been lost to time and erosion. Unlike the Egyptians who built giant pointers to their afterlife, the DMT rulers seem to have preferred a more subtle, perhaps unintentionally subtle approach to their final resting places. Either that or we just haven't found them yet, which is the historian's equivalent of saying the check is in the mail. The decline of DMT is as mysterious as its origins. Around the 5th century BCE, the inscriptions stop appearing and the major building activity seems to cease. Was it internal conflict, environmental change, shifting trade routes, or did something else entirely happen? You feel the silence where the kingdom once thrived. It's the quiet that follows collapse, the slow return of the wild to places once bustling with human activity. The rulers and the ruled of DMT faded into the landscape, their names mostly forgotten, their power dissolved. They are truly among the forgotten, these early unifiers, whose reign is marked by stone and script, but whose stories are largely lost to the ages. You can almost hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the Yeha temple walls, carrying the ghosts of their unanswered questions. You're standing there, the imagined wind carrying the last faint echoes of Dimt. You feel the silence descending. The grand temple at Yeha in your mind's eye stands less as a beacon of power and more as a lonely sentinel against the sky. The inscriptions stop. The large coordinated building projects cease. It's as if the lights went out, historically speaking. We're now stepping into what's often referred to by scholars, perhaps a touch dramatically, as the post-Dimt Dark Age. Doesn't that just sound sleepy? Like history went to bed early and forgot to leave a note. This isn't dark in the sense of being particularly grim, though life was probably plenty tough, but dark because our historical knowledge dims significantly. Imagine going from seeing shadows and outlines of a kingdom dimmed to feeling around in a room with very, very low wattage light bulbs, maybe just one flickering candle in the corner. For roughly 5 centuries, from the decline of DMT around the 5th or 4th century BCE up to the emergence of the Aksumite state sometime in the 1st century CE, the archaeological and historical record in the northern Ethiopian highlands goes frustratingly quiet. What happened during these centuries, that, my friend, is the million-dollar question that archaeologists and historians stare blankly at. We know people didn't just vanish. The land was still inhabited. There were still communities living, farming, trading, and likely squabbling amongst themselves. But the centralized, visible structures of statehood that marked DMT seem to dissipate. It's like trying to follow a stream that suddenly goes underground. You know the water is still flowing, but you can't see it anymore. Perhaps the region fragmented into smaller chiefdoms or tribal groups, none powerful enough or long-lasting enough to leave behind significant monumental architecture or lengthy inscriptions that have survived the millennia. Think of it like a large company breaking up into lots of smaller independent contractors. They're still working, still doing things, but they aren't building skyscrapers or issuing quarterly reports that historians might stumble upon later. This makes them much, much harder for us sleep-deprived historical detectives to track down. The evidence we do have from this period is scattered and frustratingly inconclusive. You might find changes in pottery styles, maybe shifts in burial practices, or evidence of different settlement patterns. Perhaps people moved to more defensible locations or settled in smaller, more dispersed groups. It's the kind of evidence that makes archaeologists stroke their chin thoughtfully and say things like, interesting assemblage, which is code for, I have absolutely no idea what this means in the grand scheme of things, but it's definitely different from last time. Imagine you are trying to reconstruct the political map of this dark age. You'd be drawing lots of question marks. Were these smaller groups constantly fighting? Was there a dominant power that just didn't build big stone temples like DMT did? Did they use perishable materials for their important structures? Did they just decide writing things down was too much effort and went back to purely oral traditions? The possibilities are vast and the concrete answers are few. It's the historical equivalent of looking for your keys in a dark room. You know they're somewhere, but you're mostly just bumping into furniture. One possible factor in Dimt's decline and the subsequent fragmentation could have been environmental. Climate change, shifts in rainfall patterns, or soil degradation could have put pressure on agriculture, the backbone of any ancient society. Imagine the land you were farming, the fields that fed your community, slowly becoming less productive. That puts immense stress on a centralized authority. People might disperse to find better land, or conflict over resources might increase. It's hard to build empires when everyone's just trying to find enough food to eat. You might walk through the archaeological layers representing these centuries and notice a difference. Below you see the foundations of larger buildings, maybe some imported goods fragments of those South Arabian-influenced inscriptions. Above you see the clear beginnings of the Aksumite period. More sophisticated pottery coins eventually appeared, different religious symbols, and eventually large stelae and palaces. But in between, a thinner layer, perhaps with less stuff. Or the stuff is just harder to interpret, more localized, less indicative of regional power. It's like flipping through a history book and suddenly finding a bunch of blank pages. You know a whole period of time is missing. This dark age is a critical missing piece of the puzzle connecting the early, somewhat visible deep kingdom to the later, much more well-documented and powerful Aksumite Empire. Without understanding what happened in these centuries, it's difficult to fully grasp how Aksum emerged. Did it grow gradually from one of these fragmented groups? Was it a new arrival from elsewhere? Did the knowledge and traditions of Diem survive in hidden pockets, waiting to re-emerge? A mainstream historical fact about this period is that archaeological surveys and excavations have struggled to identify clear, widespread evidence of large-scale political organization or monumental construction between the decline of DMT and the established Aksumite period. Sites show continuity of occupation, but on a smaller scale or with less impressive material culture. It's a historical trough, archaeologically speaking. Kind of like that awkward phase between being a kid and being a teenager, where you're not quite one thing or the other, and you definitely don't want anyone looking at your historical yearbook. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit from this murky period. While large stone inscriptions disappear, we do see changes in smaller artifacts. For example, there are subtle shifts in the style and decoration of pottery or changes in the types of tools or personal ornaments found. These smaller changes, though seemingly minor, are what archaeologists cling to in a dark age. It's like trying to understand a person's entire life story just by looking at the changing styles of their socks over 50 years. Ah, yes, Argyle in the 3rd century BCE indicates a period of striped socks, later on a seismic cultural shift. Historians still argue whether this period was a genuine collapse into widespread anarchy or simply a shift towards political structures that don't leave as much archaeological noise. Was it a catastrophic dark age of decline and fragmentation, or was it just a period where power was more diffuse, held by numerous smaller leaders who didn't bother with the whole building giant things and writing names on them habit? The debate boils down to interpreting the absence of evidence. Is absence of evidence of absence, or just evidence that our search methods aren't quite right for this particular historical hiding spot? Imagine trying to be a ruler during this time. You wouldn't be living in a fancy palace like the rulers of Aksum eventually would. Your palace might be a slightly larger hut in a village, or maybe a small hilltop fort. Your power would likely be limited to your local area. You wouldn't be overseeing vast construction projects, but maybe managing local irrigation, settling disputes, and defending your community from neighbors who were probably doing the exact same thing. Your legacy wouldn't be etched in stone, but perhaps in the memories of the few generations who followed you, quickly fading like footprints in the dust. The rulers of this dark age, if we can even use that term for individuals who might have held power over just a few villages, are truly the forgotten among the forgotten. We don't have their names. We don't know their titles. We don't know their ambitions or their fears. They are ghosts even to the archaeologists' just inferred presences from subtle changes in the dirt. There's a certain humility in that, isn't there? Building something, ruling something, and having it simply dissolve back into the earth, leaving barely a trace for future sleep-deprived historians to find. You feel the quiet of these centuries. It's a different kind of quiet than the profound primordial silence before dimmed. This silence feels lived in but muted, like walking through a house where a party happened a long time ago, and everything is now still and covered in a thin layer of dust. The echoes of Dimt are fading, and the rumble of Aksum is yet to begin. You are suspended in a historical pause a moment, where the grand narratives falter and you're left with just the wind and the earth holding secrets that might never be fully revealed. It's a good time to just breathe and let the mystery wash over you. Nothing much to see here, historically speaking, which makes it perfect for easing your mind. Just quiet earth and forgotten possibilities. The quiet hangs in the air around you, that historical pause button feeling. But even in the stillest times, things are stirring beneath the surface. Just as winter eventually gives way to the first tentative shoots of spring, the Dark Age wasn't a permanent state of historical hibernation. Somewhere in the hills and valleys of what would become northern Ethiopia and Eritrea communities were subtly beginning to grow. They were tilling the fields, raising livestock, trading goods with their neighbors, and perhaps starting to feel the pull of something larger than their immediate village or clan. You start to notice the landscape changing in your mind's eye. Not dramatically, not yet. It's not like a sudden city pops up overnight. It's more like noticing that one farmhouse has added a new wing, and then another village seems to be building a slightly more solid fence. And then perhaps there's talk of a leader who managed to resolve a long-standing dispute between two groups without resorting to everyone hitting each other with sticks. These are the small, almost invisible signs that hint at a slow coalescing of power and organization. The scattered settlements from the Dark Age weren't entirely isolated. There was still interaction, still exchange. Perhaps they traded agricultural surplus for salt or iron. Maybe they intermarried. Over generations, certain families or individuals might have gained influence, perhaps through their wealth, their wisdom, or their ability to lead in times of conflict or scarcity. Think of it like a bunch of tiny magnets scattered on a table. For a long time, they just sit there. But introduce a slightly bigger magnet, and slowly, hesitantly, the smaller ones start to orient themselves towards it. This is where the early stirrings of Axum come into play. It didn't arrive fully formed like a historical Athena springing from Zeus's forehead. Axum wasn't born as a mighty empire. It became one. Its origins are rooted in those Iron Age communities, slowly emerging from the post-DMT fragmentation. Imagine a mosaic being put together piece by piece, but the people assembling it don't even know they're building a mosaic. They're just putting stones next to each other that seem to fit. The geographical location itself played a significant role. The Aksumite heartland centered around the northern Ethiopian highlands was strategically important. It had fertile land capable of supporting a growing population. It was also situated along potential trade routes, both inland connecting to the African interior and crucially routes leading towards the Red Sea coast. Control over trade has been a historical superpower booster since, well, forever. If you can tax goods passing through your territory, you can accumulate wealth, and wealth buys influence, power, and eventually shiny things like palaces and giant stone monuments. So picture these early Aksumite leaders, whoever they were. We don't have their names yet. Sadly, they were still working on their branding. They were likely successful local chiefs or warlords who managed to expand their influence beyond their immediate village. Maybe they offered protection to smaller communities in exchange for tribute. Maybe they organized larger-scale irrigation projects that increased agricultural output, and therefore the population they could support. Maybe they were just really good at convincing people to follow them, which, let's be honest, is half the battle of leadership even today. Okay, team, if you follow me, we'll definitely get more grain and maybe even some cool seashells from the coast. Evidence for this early phase of Aksum's development is still relatively sparse compared to its later glory days, but it's there if you look closely. You might find changes in settlement patterns. Perhaps people started living in larger villages or small towns rather than just dispersed farmsteads. There might be archaeological layers showing an increase in certain types of imported goods, suggesting growing involvement in trade networks. Pottery styles might become more uniform over a wider area, indicating cultural exchange, or perhaps a shared identity beginning to form. It's like seeing a bunch of different kids' drawings scattered around, and then you start noticing that several of them are using the same type of crayon. Not definitive proof of a unified art class, but interesting. One mainstream historical fact is that archaeological investigations have identified sites in the Aksumite core region that show continuous occupation dating back to the Iron Age, preceding the classic Aksumite period. These sites gradually evolve with material culture, showing increasing complexity and connections to wider networks over the centuries, leading up to the 1st century CE, when the Aksumite state is generally considered to have become more established. It wasn't a sudden creation, but a slow buildup over several centuries. Think of it like making sourdough. It takes time for that starter to really get going and become powerful. The transition out of the Dark Age into the Aksumite period wasn't necessarily peaceful or smooth everywhere. The consolidation of power by early Aksumite leaders likely involved conflicts with neighboring groups who weren't so keen on being absorbed or controlled. History, even the sleepy kind, rarely progresses without a few bumps and bruises. Imagine those small magnets resisting the pull of the larger one, trying to cling to their own little corner of the table. There would have been friction. We start to see the emergence of a distinct material culture associated with these early Aksumites. While they initially built upon existing local traditions, you notice new elements appearing. Perhaps new forms of religious practice are emerging, incorporating local beliefs with influences from elsewhere. Maybe they start experimenting with new building techniques, foreshadowing the monumental architecture to come. It's the historical equivalent of a band figuring out their sound. They start with covers and influences, but eventually they find their own unique groove. For a quirky or fringe tidbit from this early period, consider the evidence for ironworking. Iron production was important in the Iron Age and continued into the Aksumite period. Archaeological finds of iron slag in furnaces indicate that metalworking was a significant activity. The ability to produce iron locally gave these communities access to better tools for farming and better weapons for, well, everything else. This might seem mundane, but control over a crucial technology like iron production could have been a key factor in one group gaining dominance over others. It's like being the only kid on the block with the really cool bike. Everyone else wants to hang out with you or steal your bike. The specific site of Aksum itself seems to have become increasingly important during this period. While there were other settlements, Aksum gradually emerged as the primary center of activity. Why Aksum? Its location offered access to fertile land and was well-positioned relative to trade routes. Perhaps there was a particularly charismatic or successful lineage of leaders based there. Over time, resources and people would have been drawn to this growing center, creating a positive feedback loop that fueled its expansion. Imagine a snowball rolling downhill. It starts small but picks up speed and mass as it goes. Historians still argue whether the initial rise of Aksum was primarily driven by control over Red Sea trade, by internal agricultural development and population growth, or by military expansion and conquest. Was it external forces pulling them towards power, or internal dynamics pushing them from within? It's the classic chicken or egg question for empire building. Did they become powerful because they controlled trade, or did they control trade because they were already becoming powerful through other means? The archaeological evidence suggests it was likely a combination of factors, but the exact weight and timing of each is still a subject of much learned debate and coffee-fueled discussions. You feel the energy starting to return to the land. It's not the same energy as the Dim period, which felt more rigidly organized and South Arabian influenced. This feels different, more African, more distinctly its own thing. The Aksumites were borrowing ideas, yes, but they were also forging their own identity. They were adapting technologies, developing their own forms of artistic expression, and laying the groundwork for a unique civilization. Imagine you are an inhabitant of one of these early Aksumite settlements. Life is still likely challenging. You're tied to the rhythms of agriculture vulnerable to drought and disease. But there's a sense of something building. Maybe you see more people arriving or new slightly larger buildings going up. You hear stories of successful campaigns against rival groups, or perhaps news of traders arriving with exotic goods from distant lands. There's a feeling of momentum, a sense that your community is growing in importance. These early Aksumite leaders weren't yet emperors ruling over vast territories. They were likely more akin to powerful regional chiefs. Their authority might have been based on personal loyalty, military success, and control over local resources. Their kingdom was probably more of a confederation of allied groups centered around their power base. It's like the initial stages of building a club. You start with a core group of friends, and then you slowly recruit others who are interested, maybe offering them snacks or a cool handshake to join. The process of state formation is complex, involving the gradual institutionalization of power, the development of administrative structures, and the creation of a shared identity among a population. In these centuries, the Aksumites were figuring this out probably through a lot of trial and error. They were learning how to collect tribute, how to field and organize an army, how to manage a growing population, and perhaps how to project their power beyond their immediate vicinity. Think of the difference between a large family farm and a multinational corporation. The early Aksumite state was somewhere closer to the large family farm stage, growing productive but still very much dependent on personal connections and local management. The later Aksumite Empire would become the multinational corporation with complex bureaucracy, standardized practices, and a reach far beyond its core territory. You are witnessing the very beginnings of that journey. So as you drift through this period, feel the subtle shifts. The fragmentation is lessening. Communities are consolidating. A center of power is emerging around Aksum. The land isn't just inhabited, it's starting to organize itself. The silence of the Dark Age is giving way to the first faint sounds of a state being born. The ring of hammers on iron, the murmuring of growing populations, the distant echoes of trade caravans. It's still early days, the blueprint is rough, but the construction has definitely begun. And unlike the dim lights flickering out, these lights are just starting to glow faint at first, but promising to grow brighter and brighter with each passing century. So we've seen the faint glow starting in the distance, right? The individual lights consolidating into something a bit brighter. Now, as the centuries turn and we move from the Iron Age into the early centuries of the Common Era, roughly from the 1st to the 4th century CE, that glow intensifies. This is when Axum stops being just a promising regional center and starts to look like a proper, recognizable kingdom. It's like the band that's been practicing in the garage finally releases their first single and gets some airplay. People start paying attention. You can almost feel the change in energy. The landscape feels more settled, yet also more dynamic. You see larger villages turning into small towns, and around the core area of Axum, you see the beginnings of something grander. Structures are becoming more elaborate. Burials are showing increasing signs of social stratification, meaning some people were clearly wealthier and more powerful than others, as evidenced by what they got buried with. Nobody's burying plain old rocks next to the chief, you know, and there's a growing sense of organization, of hierarchy. This wasn't an instant transformation, of course. States don't just pop into existence fully formed, complete with tax codes and national anthems. It was a gradual process building on the foundations laid in the previous centuries. Those powerful regional chiefs we talked about, their descendants or successors managed to extend their influence further, either through alliances, military might, or sheer economic leverage. They started collecting tribute or taxes more systematically, perhaps appointing officials to manage different areas or aspects of their burgeoning state. Think of the transition from being a village headman who everyone knows personally to being a king who rules over multiple towns and needs intermediaries to manage things. The scale changes. The problems change. You're no longer just worried about keeping your own neighbors happy. You're worried about rival chiefs' external threats, managing trade routes that are getting longer and more complex, and making sure enough grain is harvested to feed a growing population that isn't all farming anymore. This is the period when Axum starts to appear in external written sources, particularly from the Roman world. Roman geographers and merchants start mentioning a place, or people called Axumes or Auxumites, in relation to Red Sea trade. This is a pretty big deal. It means they were becoming significant enough on the international stage to be noticed and documented by outsiders. Before this, they were just local players. Now they're getting name-checked in ancient travelogues and trade manuals. It's like getting reviewed by a major newspaper. Sudden visibility. The primary source mentioning Axum from this early period is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek text written sometime between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. This text is essentially a merchant's guide to the ports and trade routes of the Red Sea, East Africa, and India. It mentions Axum as an emporium, a significant trading center located inland from the port of Adulis on the Red Sea coast. It talks about the goods traded there, like ivory, tortoise-shell, rhinoceros horn, and sadly, slaves in exchange for imports like cloth, metal goods, and wine. The Periplus also names the ruler of Axum at that time, referring to him as Zoskales. Now, Zoskales isn't mentioned on any Axumite inscriptions we've found yet, which is a bit frustrating, but not entirely surprising. He might have been a very early king whose rule preceded the common use of inscriptions, or perhaps the name recorded by the Greek merchant is slightly different from the name used locally. Regardless, the mention of a specific ruler signifies that Axum had a recognized political head, a figure in charge who could deal with foreign traders and control the flow of goods. This is a key marker of statehood. The Periplus describes Zoskales as being interested in Greek literature. This tidbit suggests a level of engagement with the wider Hellenistic world, hinting at cultural connections beyond just trade. Imagine this early Axumite king perhaps overseeing the bustling activity at Adulis, or in Axum itself, also taking time to read Greek scrolls. It paints a picture of a ruler who wasn't just a local strongman, but someone with broader horizons. Maybe he saw learning Greek as a way to understand his trading partners better, or maybe he just liked a good story. Who knows, this early Axumite kingdom began to expand its influence, likely incorporating neighboring groups and territories. The focus of this expansion was probably driven by the desire to control key trade routes, secure resources like ivory and gold from the interior, and perhaps also by the need to defend their borders or preemptively strike against rivals. The kingdom wasn't a massive empire yet, but it was growing, flexing its muscles. Think of it as a young sapling starting to push its branches out. Archaeology provides evidence for this expansion through the distribution of Aksumite material culture. Things like pottery coins, which start appearing later in this period in architectural styles, found at sites beyond the immediate Aksum area. The presence of Aksumite artifacts or building methods in other regions suggests either direct Aksumite control, significant Aksumite influence, or strong trade, cultural links. One mainstream historical fact about this period is the increasing importance of Adulis as Aksum's main port on the Red Sea. The control and development of Adulis were crucial for Aksum's prosperity. It was the gateway through which goods flowed in and out, connecting Aksum to the lucrative trade networks of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and India. The wealth generated from this trade would provide the resources that would fuel Aksum's later monumental constructions and military power. Adulis wasn't just a port, it was Aksum's lifeline to the global economy of the ancient world. Imagine all those ships arriving laden with exotic goods, the docks bustling with activity, the air thick with the smell of spices and salt. The early Aksumite economy was based on a combination of agriculture and trade. The fertile highlands supported a growing population engaged in farming, producing grains like wheat and barley, as well as raising livestock. This agricultural base provided stability and surplus, which could support non-farming elites, craftspeople, and soldiers, as well as providing goods for trade. Meanwhile, the control over trade routes, particularly the export of African products like ivory and gold, generated significant wealth for the ruling elite. It's a classic formula for state-building feed. Your people make money from trade and use some of that money to build up your power. Simple, right? Historical spoiler alert. It's never actually simple. For a quirky or fringe tidbit from this early kingdom period, consider the evidence of pre-Christian religious practices. Before the adoption of Christianity in the 4th century, the Aksumites likely practiced a complex mix of indigenous beliefs and perhaps some influences from South Arabian paganism. Remember them. Inscriptions from slightly later kings, but reflecting earlier practices, mention deities like Astur-Bahir and Meter. We know relatively little about these practices compared to Aksum's later Christian period, but archaeological finds like altars and offerings provide tantalizing hints. One interesting possibility is that some early Aksumite religious rituals involved animal sacrifice and perhaps veneration of celestial bodies. Imagine elaborate ceremonies conducted under the starry Ethiopian sky, seeking favor from gods whose names are now mostly lost to time. The relationship between the emerging Aksumite state and the communities in the surrounding regions would have been complex. Some might have been incorporated peacefully through alliances or integration. Others were likely subdued through military force. The Aksumite rulers would have needed to develop ways to administer these newly acquired territories, perhaps by appointing local governors or integrating existing leadership structures into their own system. It was a period of consolidation, pushing the boundaries of what Aksum could control. We start to see the beginnings of a distinct Aksumite identity emerge during this time. While there are still echoes of earlier influences, particularly in architecture and some artistic motifs, Aksumite culture is developing its own unique characteristics. This is reflected in their pottery, their metalwork, and later in their inscriptions and coinage. They weren't just copying others anymore. They were creating their own style. It's like a teenager finally deciding what clothes they want to wear instead of just wearing whatever their parents bought them. A watershed moment. The royal burials of this period, even before the famous stelae were erected, show increasing wealth and power. Excavations at sites around Aksum have revealed tombs containing rich grave goods, including gold ornaments, imported items, and elaborate pottery. These burials are not just individual graves, they are becoming symbols of royal power and lineage, anchoring the ruling dynasty to the land and projecting their authority even in death. Historians still argue whether the early Aksumite kings were primarily religious figures, military leaders, or economic controllers. Was their authority based more on their perceived connection to the divine, their ability to win battles, or their control over wealth and trade? It was likely a blend of all these things, as is often the case with early monarchies. But the exact balance in which factor was the most important driver of their rise to power is still a lively subject of academic discussion. Did they convince people they were blessed by the gods? Did they simply have the biggest army? Or did everyone just follow whoever had the most gold? Probably a bit of column A, B, and C. The development of a monumental architectural tradition begins in earnest during this period, foreshadowing the later even more impressive stelae and palaces. While the giant carved stelae we often associate with Aksum come later, the practice of marking important burials or sites with large stones likely has its roots in this early kingdom phase. You might see larger stone structures being built, perhaps early palaces or temples, indicating the ability to mobilize significant labor and resources. This early Aksumite kingdom was actively engaged in the wider world. We know about their trade links with the Mediterranean and India through the Periplus. They were also likely interacting with kingdoms and communities further south and west in Africa, although the evidence for these interactions is less documented in external written sources. Aksum was becoming a hub, a point of connection between different regions and cultures. Imagine being a merchant arriving at Adulis during this time. You've perhaps sailed from Egypt or Arabia or even India. You arrive at this busy port, see goods from all over, and know that inland, up in the highlands, is the power that controls this vital gateway. You might travel inland yourself up towards Aksum, a journey that takes several days. As you approach the city, you see signs of increasing prosperity and organization. Larger buildings, perhaps irrigated fields, and a sense of order that wasn't present in the more fragmented regions. The kings of this early period were laying the groundwork for everything that followed. They established the core territory, consolidated power, developed the economic base, and began to engage with the outside world in a significant way. They might not have built the largest monuments or issued the most famous coins yet, but without their efforts, the Aksumite Empire as we know it would never have existed. They were the crucial stepping stones, the pioneers who took Aksum from being a regional power to a state on the cusp of becoming something truly great. As you settle deeper into this era, feel the slow hum of a growing state. It's the sound of construction, the murmur of markets, the rhythmic beat of distant drums signaling authority or ceremony, the creak of trade caravans, and the distant crash of waves at the busy port of Adulis. Aksum is finding its feet, learning to walk, and preparing to run. The lights are definitely brighter now, casting a growing pool of influence over the surrounding lands. All right, so Aksum is finding its feet, the glow is intensifying, and you're watching this early kingdom take shape, flexing its muscles a bit. Now imagine fast-forwarding just a little, maybe a century or two, into the 4th century CE. This is where that promising startup goes full corporate. This is when Aksum enters its golden age, a period of incredible power, wealth, and influence that would make those early chiefs look like local village mayors. You can almost feel the ground vibrating slightly under your feet. They aren't just walking, now they're marching. The 4th to the 6th century CE mark the undeniable peak of Aksumite power. This is when the kingdom transforms into a recognized empire, controlling vast territories, dominating Red Sea trade, and engaging in complex diplomacy and warfare with major powers like the Roman, later Byzantine Empire, and the kingdoms of South Arabia. The names of the rulers from this era are recorded not just on local monuments, but in foreign histories sung by poets, and even inscribed on coins that circulated widely. The kings of this period were formidable figures. Names like Ezana Caleb and others resonate through the history of the region. These weren't just names in a trade manual like Zoskales. These were rulers issuing decrees, commissioning massive building projects, leading armies, and fundamentally changing the cultural and religious landscape of their kingdom. They left behind a wealth of evidence of their power and actions, primarily in the form of impressive stone inscriptions and beautifully crafted coins. One of the most pivotal events in Aksumite history, and one that happens early in this golden age, is the adoption of Christianity. This is traditionally linked to the reign of King Ezana in the 4th century CE. The story, as told by later historical sources like the church historian Rufinus, involves 2 Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Adesius, who were shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast. They were taken to the Aksumite court, where they rose in prominence. Frumentius eventually traveled to Alexandria, where he was consecrated as the first bishop of Aksum, by Athanasius, the powerful patriarch of Alexandria. You can almost picture young Frumenius maybe starting as a tutor or administrator in the royal court, gradually introducing Christian ideas. It's not like he just showed up one day with a Bible and said, "Hey, check this out." It would have been a gradual process of influence discussion and perhaps seeing some potential strategic advantages in aligning with the Christian Roman Empire. Think of it as a slow-burn spiritual revolution. King Ezana's conversion wasn't instantaneous or total across the kingdom, but his personal adoption of Christianity was incredibly significant. We see evidence for this shift directly in his inscriptions. Earlier inscriptions by Ezana invoke pagan deities like Astur and Behir, similar to those mentioned in section 5. Later inscriptions, however, invoke the Lord of Heaven and refer to Christ. His coins also change. Early issues feature pagan symbols like the disc and crescent, while later ones prominently display the Christian cross. This is a direct archaeological record of a major religious transformation. It's like finding someone's social media feed and seeing their profile picture change from a favorite rock band logo to a picture of a fluffy kitten, a clear, documented shift in allegiance. The adoption of Christianity had profound implications for Axum. It aligned the kingdom with the Byzantine Empire, its major trading partner to the north. This religious connection fostered diplomatic ties and cultural exchange. It also eventually provided a unifying ideology for the diverse peoples within the growing empire. Axum became a major center of Christianity in Northeast Africa, a status it maintains to this day in Ethiopia. Imagine the change in daily life, new rituals, new holidays, new forms of worship replacing older ones. Churches, even simple early ones, starting to appear alongside older shrines. Another defining feature of this golden age is the monumental architecture, specifically the giant carved stelae in the city of Axum. These are not just big stones. They are massive, intricately carved granite obelisks, some standing incredibly tall, others having fallen. The largest intact one is around 23 meters high, while the largest ever erected, now fallen and broken, would have been over 33 meters tall. The tallest single stone monument ever erected in the ancient world. Yes, taller than anything the Egyptians managed with a single stone. They must have been showing off. These stelae are carved to represent multi-story buildings, complete with false doors, windows, and distinctive Axumite features. They are thought to be markers for underground burial chambers of the Axumite royalty and elite. Imagine the sheer engineering challenge of quarrying these massive blocks, transporting them several kilometers from the quarry to the city, carving them, and then raising them upright. It would have required incredible organization labor and technical skill. We still don't know exactly how they did it, which is a pretty cool ancient mystery, right? You picture ropes, levers, lots of people pushing and pulling, probably some very stressed ancient engineers. The stelae aren't just impressive feats of engineering. They are also powerful symbols of the Axumite state's wealth, power, and control over resources and labor. Erecting such monuments projected the authority of the king and commemorated their lineage. Standing among the fields of stelae today, you can't help but feel a sense of awe at the ambition and capability of the people who built them. They scream, "We were here, and we were important." Simultaneously, the Axumites began minting their own coins in gold, silver, and bronze, starting from the reign of Endubis in the late 3rd or early 4th century CE. This is a major marker of statehood and economic sophistication. Very few ancient African kingdoms south of Egypt issued their own coinage. Axum did, and they did it extensively. The coins weren't just for local use. Axumite gold coins have been found in places as far away as India and the Mediterranean, indicating their integration into international trade networks. Axumite coins are also invaluable historical sources. They bear the names and portraits of the kings, often accompanied by symbols or mottos. As mentioned, the religious symbols change over time, providing evidence for the conversion to Christianity. The value and purity of the metal also varied, reflecting the economic health and stability of the kingdom at different times. Holding an Axumite coin today is like holding a tiny piece of propaganda and economic data rolled into one crafted by artisans over 1,000 years ago. Pretty neat. The language used in the Axumite inscriptions also evolves during this period. While earlier inscriptions might have used South Arabian scripts or Greek the Golden Age, sees the widespread use of the Ge'ez script, the ancestor of modern Ethiopian and Eritrean scripts. Inscriptions are often trilingual, written in Ge'ez Greek and Sabaic, an old South Arabian language reflecting Aksum's diverse cultural connections and its desire to communicate with different audiences. Ge'ez inscriptions from kings like Azana detail military campaigns, building projects, and religious pronouncements. Reading or getting a scholar to read these inscriptions allows you to hear the voice of the kings themselves telling you what they thought was important. The economy of the Golden Age Aksumite Empire was robust, built on the foundations laid in the earlier period, but operating on a much larger scale. Control of trade routes remained crucial. Adulis was still the primary port bustling with activity. Exports included luxury goods like ivory, gold, frankincense, and myrrh from the interior, as well as potentially slaves. Imports included fine textiles, metal goods, wine, olive oil, and manufactured items from the Roman world, India, and beyond. The fertile highlands continued to provide agricultural surplus, supporting the urban centers and the large workforce needed for monumental building and military campaigns. Aksum's influence extended far beyond its core territory. Military campaigns mentioned in inscriptions show Aksumite armies venturing into Nubia, modern Sudan, to the north across the Red Sea into South Arabia, and into the interior of the Horn of Africa. Aksum became a regional superpower capable of projecting its power across land and sea. Their campaigns in South Arabia were particularly significant, leading to periods of Aksumite control or heavy influence over parts of what is now Yemen. This wasn't just trade. This was serious geopolitical muscle flexing. For a quirky or fringe tidbit from this period, consider the possible use of elephants in the Aksumite army. Some ancient sources suggest that Aksum, like some other ancient powers, might have used war elephants. While concrete archaeological evidence is scarce, the region was home to African elephants. Imagine the psychological impact of an elephant charge on an enemy army, not used to facing such beasts. It conjures up images straight out of ancient epic movies, though we don't have any detailed Aksumite accounts of elephant warfare. Historians still aren't certain how significant, if at all, elephants were to Aksumite military power, but the idea adds a fascinating, slightly mysterious element to their armies. Were they like ancient Aksumite tanks? Maybe the administrative structure of the Aksumite Empire during this period is still somewhat debated by historians. We know there were officials, governors, appointed to control territories, and certainly a centralized authority around the king. But how hierarchical was it? How much autonomy did local rulers retain? Did they have a formalized bureaucracy, or was it more based on personal relationships and loyalty? Historians still argue whether Aksum was a truly centralized state like the Roman Empire, or more of a confederation of tribute-paying regions under the Aksumite king's loose suzerainty. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, evolving over time. It's hard to write a definitive organizational chart for an empire that existed 1,500 years ago, especially when their ancient HR department didn't leave many records. The Aksumites were also skilled craftspeople. Archaeological finds reveal sophisticated pottery metalwork, including gold and silver ornaments, glass and ivory carvings. Their artisans were capable of producing both utilitarian objects and high-status luxury goods for the elite and for export. The quality of their craftsmanship reflects the wealth and artistic development of the empire. Think about the daily life in Aksum during this golden age. You'd see people going about their business in the shadow of the towering stele, merchants from distant lands haggling in the markets, priests performing rituals in the newly built churches, artisans hammering metal or shaping clay. The king and his court would be at the center of it all, residing perhaps in multi-story palaces, built of stone and timber, overseeing trade, administering justice, and planning campaigns. It was a vibrant, dynamic city, a true imperial capital. The relationship with South Arabia was particularly significant. Across the narrow Red Sea lay powerful kingdoms like Himyar. Aksumite inscriptions mention campaigns and periods of control in this region, often linked to protecting Christian communities there or securing trade interests. This cross-Red Sea interaction shaped the politics and culture of both regions for centuries and will come up again later. It wasn't just a sea that separated them. It was more like a major highway, albeit a wet and sometimes dangerous one. This golden age wasn't static. It evolved over time. The focus shifted, rulers changed, and challenges arose. But the period from the 4th to the 6th century CE represents the pinnacle of Aksumite power and cultural achievement. It's when they built their most iconic monuments, spread their faith, minted their most famous coins, and exerted influence across a vast region. They weren't just a significant regional center anymore. They were a recognized world power standing alongside empires like Byzantium and Persia, playing their part on the global stage of antiquity. You feel the weight of that history here, the echoes of imperial commands and the clinking of gold coins carried on the wind. So you've got this thriving empire, Aksum flexing its muscles, building towering stones minting gold, and basically telling the world they've arrived. They're connected to the Byzantine Empire, tied into global trade, and have adopted Christianity, which suddenly gives them a reason to care about the religious welfare of people outside their immediate borders. And that brings us neatly across the Red Sea because right over there, just a relatively short boat trip away, were the kingdoms of South Arabia, particularly the powerful Himyarite kingdom. Now, Aksum and South Arabia had a long history of interaction, trade migration, cultural exchange, and sometimes conflict. Remember how we talked about South Arabian scripts influencing early Aksumite writing? That connection goes way back. But during Aksum's golden age, this relationship became much more intense, particularly in the late 5th and early 6th centuries CE. This is where King Caleb comes into the picture, a name that echoes through both Ethiopian and South Arabian history, often with a touch of awe or dread depending on whose side you were on. You can imagine Caleb sitting in his palace in Aksum, receiving reports from across the water. For a while, things in Himyar had been complicated. Different religious groups, pagan, Jewish, and Christian, coexisted often uneasily. But then a king named Yusuf Asar Yathar came to power in Himyar, known to Christian sources as Du Nuwas. And Du Nuwas, for reasons that are still debated, was it religious conviction, political expediency, or trying to break ties with the Byzantine-aligned Aksum, began persecuting the Christian population within his kingdom. And we're not talking about politely asking them to leave the neighborhood book club. Sources describe rather brutal actions, including the infamous massacre of Christians in the city of Najran, a major center with strong ties to the Christian world. News travels slowly by ancient standards, but it travels. And when word of massacres of fellow Christians reached Aksum, particularly the king, it was seen not just as a regional issue, but as a direct challenge. Aksum had recently adopted Christianity, and its identity was increasingly linked to this new faith. Protecting Christians abroad wasn't just a pious act. It was a way of asserting Aksum's place as a major Christian power, equal in a sense to Byzantium, and demonstrating its commitment to its new faith. Plus, South Arabia was important for trade. Messing with stability there wasn't good for business. So Caleb decided to act. He wasn't just going to send a strongly worded letter. He was going to send an army, and not just any army, only an army transported across the sea. This is a massive undertaking for the 6th century. Imagine gathering ships, provisions, thousands of soldiers, horses, maybe even elephants, who knows, and all the gear needed for an invasion, and then getting them across the potentially choppy waters of the Red Sea. It speaks volumes about Aksum's organizational capacity and naval strength. They didn't just have a few dhows pottering around, they had a serious fleet. Building those ships alone would have been a huge project. Was there an ancient Aksumite shipbuilders union? Probably not, but there must have been a lot of very busy people with hammers and wood. The traditional date for Caleb's main invasion is around 525 CE. He launched a massive expeditionary force towards the South Arabian coast. Sources describe different landing points, but the goal was clear: confront Du Nuwas and put an end to the persecution. The Aksumite forces landed and advanced inland, engaging the Himyarite army. The details of the battles are somewhat pieced together from various historical accounts, including Syriac, Byzantine, and later Arabic sources, as well as Himyarite inscriptions that interestingly downplay the scale of the defeat. Imagine that, writing history and just conveniently forgetting the bit where a foreign army came, kicked down your door, and took over. Classic. Caleb's campaign was successful. The Aksumite forces defeated Du. Nuwas's army captured major cities like Zafar, the Himyarite capital, and Najran, and reportedly put Du Nuwas to death. Some accounts say he rode his horse into the sea rather than be captured. This victory was huge. It established Aksumite dominance over Himyar and secured the safety of the Christian population. Caleb appointed a Himyarite Christian named Sumyafa Ashwa, known in Byzantine sources as Isimaphaios, as a client king initially followed shortly after by Abraha, an Aksumite general or governor, who would go on to become a significant figure himself ruling Himyar, with a degree of independence from Aksum. The significance of these campaigns cannot be overstated. Firstly, they demonstrated Aksum's reach. This wasn't just controlling the highlands around Aksum or the trade routes to the coast. This was projecting power across a major body of water into another sophisticated region. Aksum was not just a regional player, it was a major force in the geopolitics of the Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula. They were now a player on a stage that included the Byzantine and Sasanian Persian empires, who also had interests in South Arabia. Secondly, it solidified Aksum's identity as a defender of Christianity. This earned them respect and closer ties with Byzantium, their major economic and political partner. It put Aksum squarely within the sphere of the Christian world powers. It was a powerful statement. We are Christian, we are strong, and we will protect our co-religionists. Think of it as Aksum announcing its arrival as a major power player on the global religious political chessboard. You can almost hear the ancient equivalent of mic drop. Thirdly, it gave Aksum control or significant influence over key trade hubs in South Arabia, which were vital links in the Indian Ocean trade network connecting East Africa, Arabia, Persia, and India. Controlling these ports and inland centers bolstered Aksum's already considerable wealth derived from trade. Imagine the goods flowing through those ports. Silks from the East, spices, precious stones alongside African exports like ivory and gold. Aksum was sitting pretty controlling key nodes in this ancient superhighway of commerce. Caleb's reign is seen as a high point of Aksumite power and is well documented compared to some earlier periods. We have inscriptions from Caleb himself often detailing his military victories and attributing them to God, reflecting his piety. He even allegedly abdicated his throne later in life to live a life of asceticism, sending his crown to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. A story that underscores his devotion and the connections between Aksum and the wider Christian world, even though historians still debate the exact details and timing of his alleged abdication. It's a bit like a CEO suddenly deciding to become a monk and sending their golden parachute to a famous charity. Unexpected if true. For a quirky tidbit related to this campaign, consider the sheer logistics of moving thousands of troop supplies and potentially animals across the Red Sea in ancient ships. We're not talking about modern ferries or cargo ships. These were likely relatively small sail and oar-powered vessels. Some accounts suggest the initial crossing might have been challenging with potential losses. Imagine the scene, a huge number of boats of varying sizes, perhaps some repurposed merchant ships, gathering at a port like Adulis, or a smaller embarkation point being loaded up with anxious soldiers. Food that would probably go off way too quickly, weapons, and maybe even some livestock for food or transport. The smell alone must have been something else. The coordination needed would have been immense. Was there a chief ancient boat packer? Probably. His job satisfaction level might have been variable. Now, while Caleb's invasion was a clear success in overthrowing Dunawas and establishing Aksumite presence, the nature and duration of Aksumite rule in South Arabia afterward are points of open scholarly debate. Did Aksum directly govern the region for a significant period? Or was their control more indirect, relying on local allies and tribute? Sources are sometimes contradictory, and the evidence suggests that while Aksumite influence was strong and lasted for several decades, certainly through the rule of Abraha, it wasn't necessarily stable direct rule from Aksum itself. Rebellions and internal conflicts in Himyar continued, and eventually the Sasanian Empire Persia intervened, driving out the Aksumite presence in the late 6th century CE. So while Aksum conquered it, holding on to it was a different story. Historians still argue whether this period was an outright Aksumite occupation, a period of Aksumite hegemony via client rulers, or a mix that changed over time depending on the strength of the king in Aksum or the ruler in Himyar. It's like trying to figure out exactly how much influence a distant head office has over a challenging branch location based only on old expense reports and a few angry letters. The campaigns also had a lasting impact on South Arabia itself. They marked the end of a long line of independent Himyarite kings and ushered in a period of foreign Aksumite and later Sasanian domination before the rise of Islam. This intervention fundamentally altered the political and social landscape of the Arabian Peninsula just decades before the Prophet Muhammad. The memory of the Aksumite presence, particularly the rule of Abraha, who is mentioned in Islamic tradition, notably concerning his alleged expedition against Mecca, persisted for centuries. Caleb is often remembered as one of Aksum's greatest kings, a powerful warrior and a pious defender of the faith. His actions across the Red Sea cemented Aksum's reputation and expanded its sphere of influence to its greatest extent. Imagine the tales told around campfires or in bustling markets back in Aksum after a successful campaign in Arabia. Stories of sea crossings, battles fought in distant lands, and the wealth flowing back home. You can almost hear the buzz of excitement and pride. This period of intervention in South Arabia, while ultimately temporary in terms of direct rule, highlights a crucial aspect of Aksumite power during its golden age: its amphibious capability and its strategic importance in the wider Red Sea and Indian Ocean world. They weren't just a land power, they were a sea power too capable of launching large-scale expeditions across water. That's something quite rare for an ancient African kingdom. It shows a level of sophistication in logistics, military organization, and naval technology that is truly impressive. Think about the journey across the sea. It's not just a matter of getting on a boat. You have tides, currents, potential storms, navigation challenges, and the simple fact that most ancient people weren't exactly expert swimmers if something went wrong. The success of Caleb's expedition relied on skilled sailors and navigators, likely drawing on long-standing maritime traditions along the Red Sea coast, perhaps incorporating knowledge from traders and seafarers who plied these waters regularly. It adds another layer to the impressive capabilities of the Aksumite state during this peak period. They weren't just carving stones, they were mastering the waves. So Caleb conquers Himyar, avenges the Christians, and puts Aksum firmly on the map as a major player in the Red Sea. While holding on to Himyar proved difficult in the long run, the campaign itself was a major achievement and a defining moment of the Aksumite Golden Age. It shows a kingdom operating at the height of its power, driven by economic interests, religious conviction, and strategic ambition. It's a story of ancient superpower intervention, complete with sea invasions, regime change, and complex regional politics. And you drifting off to sleep are right there on the shore watching the ships depart for Arabia, wondering what tales they will bring back. So King Caleb launched this impressive sea-crossing invasion rite. You saw the ships setting sail, heard the tales of battle, and watched Aksum project its power across the Red Sea to take control of the Himyarite kingdom in South Arabia. He defeated Dunuas and installed a new ruler, initially Smiafa Ashwa. But things in newly conquered territories, especially ones vital for trade and caught between competing empires like Byzantium and the Sasanians, that's the Persian Empire, remember, are rarely simple. The transition wasn't perfectly smooth, and maintaining control from across the water was a persistent challenge. Enter Abraha. The historical sources paint a picture of Abraha as an Aksumite military commander, possibly a general or a governor appointed by Caleb to help manage the newly acquired South Arabian territories. But he wasn't just a bureaucrat in sandals. He was ambitious, capable, and found himself in a region seething with complex loyalties and power struggles. Exactly when and how he consolidated his power isn't perfectly clear, but he emerged as the dominant figure in Himyar, eventually displacing or perhaps even rebelling against the initial ruler appointed by Caleb. This moment is significant because it marks a shift. While Aksumite Abraha began to rule South Arabia with a considerable degree of autonomy, possibly even acting almost independently of Aksum proper, after Caleb's death or alleged abdication. This level of autonomy is one of those points historians still argue whether it represented a controlled delegation of power from Aksum or a practical secession where Aksum didn't have the means or will to rein him in fully. Was he a loyal viceroy or a successful usurper? It's complicated. Abraha's rule in South Arabia, generally placed in the mid-6th century CE, is fascinating because we have quite a bit of evidence from his time, particularly inscriptions. Unlike some earlier periods, Abraha was keen on leaving his mark quite literally. His inscriptions, often found on stelae or buildings in South Arabia, document his campaigns, building projects, and sometimes even diplomatic interactions. You can almost imagine him dictating these messages, wanting the world, or at least future generations, to know how powerful and important he was. Here lies the record of Abraham, who did awesome stuff and built this giant thing. Don't forget me, Chiu. He seems to have been a shrewd ruler. While maintaining the Aksumite presence and Christianity as a prominent religion, he also sought to integrate himself into the South Arabian political landscape. He ruled from Sana'a, a major city in Yemen, and undertook significant building projects, perhaps most famously, the construction of a large church in Sana'a, known in some sources as Al-Khalis or Al-Kules. This church was reportedly magnificent, intended to rival important Christian sanctuaries elsewhere, perhaps even the Kaaba in Mecca, according to later traditions. Think of it as a massive public works project designed to showcase the power and prestige of the new regime and its faith. Building something that grand requires serious resources, skilled labor, and a clear vision. Imagine the noise, the dust, the sheer effort involved in raising such a structure in the 6th century. It wasn't like you could just order concrete from Amazon. Abraham also had to deal with continued resistance and internal strife in South Arabia. Ruling a diverse region with different tribes, traditions, and religious affiliations wasn't easy. His inscriptions mentioned military campaigns to suppress rebellions and consolidate his control over various parts of the territory. He wasn't just sitting back and enjoying the view, he was actively engaged in maintaining order and projecting his authority. He was effectively running his own kingdom, albeit one established by Aksum, and still at least initially tied to it. His rule was also heavily influenced by the broader geopolitical context. South Arabia was a strategic prize, the Byzantine Empire. Aksum's allies saw Aksumite control of Himyar as a way to counter the influence of their great rivals, the Sasanian Empire, who also coveted control of the lucrative trade routes through the region. Abraham found himself navigating this complex web of imperial rivalries. He seems to have maintained ties with Byzantium, potentially receiving support or recognition from them, further solidifying his position as a major regional player, independent enough to conduct his own foreign policy to an extent. Imagine attending diplomatic meetings where representatives from the Aksumite court, the Byzantine emperor, and Abraham's own administration are all trying to figure out who's in charge of what and who owes allegiance to whom. Awkward holiday parties for sure, but perhaps the most famous or infamous exploit attributed to Abraham, and a definite mainstream historical fact, widely accepted though with different interpretations, is his military expedition towards Mecca. This event is central to early Islamic history and is traditionally dated to the Year of the Elephant, often placed around 570 CE, the traditional birth year of the Prophet Muhammad. According to these accounts, Abraham led a large army which included war elephants towards Mecca, possibly with the intention of destroying the Kaaba, which was at that time a prominent pagan sanctuary, but also a major pilgrimage and trade center. The story recounts that the elephants refused to approach the city, and the army was destroyed by flocks of birds dropping stones, or perhaps divine intervention, depending on the source. While the miraculous elements are subject to faith, the core account of Abraham leading an expedition towards Mecca is widely believed to have happened and is even referenced briefly in the Quran chapter 105, Surah Al-Fil, the elephant. Historians still debate the precise motives and scale of this expedition. Was it purely religious, aiming to eliminate a pagan rival to his Christian church in Sana'a? Was it economic, trying to disrupt the Meccan trade route and divert traffic further south? Was it political, aiming to extend his influence northward? Or was it a combination? The existence of war elephants in the army suggests significant resources and ambition. Aksumite kings were known to use elephants in warfare. Remember those potential elephant sightings near the stelae? Now imagine them crossing the desert towards Mecca. It's a powerful image. While Abraham's inscription found in South Arabia details campaigns further north in the Arabian Peninsula, it doesn't explicitly mention Mecca or the Kaaba, which adds another layer to the historical puzzle. Did he not consider it important enough to record? Or was the tradition, while based on a real expedition, later embellished? It's one of those points where historical sources and religious traditions intersect, leaving room for scholarly analysis and, yes, ongoing debate. Historians still argue whether the elephant story is a literal account or a significant historical event interpreted metaphorically. This campaign towards Mecca, even if unsuccessful, highlights the reach of Abraham's power from his base in South Arabia. He wasn't content just to rule Himyar. He was trying to assert influence over Central Arabia. This demonstrates the peak of Aksumite-derived power, projecting deep into the Arabian Peninsula, far beyond the initial coastal landing points. It shows how the ripples from Caleb's initial invasion spread outwards, affecting the political dynamics of the entire region, just decades before the seismic shift of the rise of Islam. Beyond military campaigns and grand churches, Abraha's rule saw continued economic activity and integration of South Arabia into the Red Sea trade network dominated by Aksum. The ports like Aden and others were vital links. Abraha, like his Aksumite predecessors, understood the importance of controlling these trade arteries. His kingdom thrived on the flow of goods between Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean. For a quirky tidbit, consider the elephants in Abraha's army. War elephants were a significant military asset in the ancient world, often used as mobile towers of destruction or psychological weapons. The fact that Abraha could deploy elephants, which were likely sourced from Africa, transported across the Red Sea, presumably before or during Caleb's initial invasion, or perhaps later as imports and maintained in the drier climate of Yemen, speaks volumes about the logistical capabilities and wealth of his state. Keeping elephants happy and healthy requires a lot of food and specialized care. Was there an ancient Aksumite Yemen Elephant Corps veterinary unit? Probably not, but someone had to keep those giants marching. Imagine the planning meetings. Okay, we've got 10,000 troops, 500 horses, and how much hay for the elephants? Abraha's reign, despite its power and ambition, didn't represent a permanent state of affairs. As we'll see, controlling South Arabia from across the sea, even with a powerful viceroy like Abraha, proved difficult in the long run. Internal dissent, external pressures from the Sasanians, who eventually launched their own intervention, and shifting regional dynamics ultimately led to the end of Aksumite influence in South Arabia towards the late 6th century CE. But for a period under Abraha, this corner of the Arabian Peninsula was effectively an extension of the Aksumite world, a testament to the kingdom's remarkable reach and military might at its zenith. His rule serves as a fascinating case study in how empires manage distant territories and how appointed governors can sometimes become powers unto themselves. Abraha was a product of the Aksumite conquest, but became a distinct figure whose legacy is intertwined with the history of both Yemen and the broader Arabian Peninsula on the eve of Islam. He inherited the power base established by Caleb, but molded it into something perhaps more personal and independent, driven by his own ambitions and the realities of ruling a complex region far from the Aksumite heartland. You can almost hear the echoes of his commands across the dusty plains of Yemen, the trumpeting of those legendary elephants, and the discussions in Sana'a about the power struggles unfolding. Abraha left a significant mark, a chapter of Aksumite history played out on Arabian soil, before the curtain fell on that particular act. So you were watching Abraha, the powerful Aksumite viceroy, or maybe not so viceroy, depending on who you ask, ruling his little empire in South Arabia, building massive churches, and even marching elephants towards Mecca. It seemed like Aksumite power projected across the Red Sea was firmly established, a permanent feature of the late antique world. But history, as you know, rarely sits still, especially in a region as contested and commercially vital as the Arabian Peninsula. The peak of Aksum's influence under Caleb and Abraha was followed not by a prolonged plateau, but by a gradual, sometimes messy decline in their overseas holdings. The grip loosened. The loss of South Arabia, specifically the Himyarite kingdom they had conquered, was the most significant sign that things were shifting. Remember those Sasanian Persians we mentioned, the great rivals of the Byzantines? Well, they weren't exactly thrilled about Aksumite control of a key point on the India-Red Sea trade route that they also wanted a piece of. The Sasanian Empire, centered in Persia, modern-day Iran, was a formidable power with its own ambitions and a complex relationship with various Arabian tribes and kingdoms. They saw Aksum's presence in Himyar as both a strategic threat and an economic obstacle. Local resistance in Himyar also played a role. Not everyone was happy under Aksumite or Abraha's rule. There were local Himyarite elites and tribes who chafed under foreign domination, even if it brought some stability and economic integration into the Aksumite Byzantine sphere. One prominent figure often mentioned in later sources is Saif ibn di Yazan, a member of the old Himyarite royal family. He reportedly sought help from various powers to expel the Aksumites, eventually finding a willing and capable patron in the Sasanian Shah Khosrow I. This is where the Sasanians made their move. Khosrow, perhaps seeing an opportunity to strike a blow against Aksum and its Byzantine allies while securing a valuable trade hub, reportedly dispatched an expeditionary force to South Arabia. The exact size and timing of this invasion are points historians still argue whether they involved a single massive push or a series of incursions. But the outcome is clear. The Sasanian forces, often described as a relatively small but highly disciplined and well-led army likely transported by sea from the Persian Gulf down the Arabian coast, landed in South Arabia. Imagine you're an Aksumite soldier stationed near the coast, maybe lounging around thinking about how easy life is now that the locals are mostly pacified. Suddenly, ships appear on the horizon, but they don't look like the familiar Aksumite or Byzantine vessels. These have the banners of the Sasanian Empire. You brace yourself. This wasn't just another tribal skirmish. This was a clash of empires played out on the beaches and in the wadis of Yemen. The Sasanian intervention marked a direct challenge that Aksum, for whatever reason, couldn't effectively counter in the long term. The Sasanian commander often credited with leading this force is Varez or Wariz. According to traditional accounts, his army, supported by local Himyarite allies like Saif ibn Yazan, engaged and defeated the Aksumite forces loyal to Abraha's successors. Abraha himself had likely passed away by this time. The Aksumite presence in South Arabia was systematically dismantled. Their garrisons were overthrown, their administrators expelled or killed, and their direct rule ended. Saif ibn Yazan was installed as a Sasanian vassal ruler, although he too was later killed, leading to direct Sasanian governorship. South Arabia became for a period a Sasanian province. This loss wasn't just about territory, it was a significant blow to Aksum's economy and prestige. Controlling South Arabia gave Aksum influence over crucial parts of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade. Goods like spices, incense, and silk passed through these ports. Losing control meant losing revenue and losing leverage in regional trade networks. It also signaled to other powers that Aksum's reach, while impressive, had its limits. It was like having a really successful branch office overseas, only for a competitor to swoop in and take over the building. Very annoying for HQ back in Aksum. Why couldn't Aksum defend its overseas territory? This is where the picture gets fuzzier and multiple factors likely converged. Distance was certainly a factor. Managing and reinforcing a territory across the Red Sea, especially against a power like the Sasanians, who could potentially use different invasion routes, like coming down the Arabian coast, was logistically challenging. Aksum's fleet, while capable of invasion under Caleb, might not have been sufficient to maintain control and repel a determined Sasanian naval or sea-supported land invasion indefinitely. It's a long ferry ride to send reinforcements when someone's already kicked down your door. Furthermore, Aksum itself might have been facing internal pressures or shifts in focus. While the historical record is less detailed for this precise period, compared to Caleb's reign, kingdoms rarely decline solely due to external factors. Were there succession disputes after Caleb? Was there a shift in the power balance within the kingdom, perhaps away from the coastal trade-focused elites towards inland agricultural or military power bases? Some theories suggest a gradual movement of the political center of gravity further inland over centuries, potentially diminishing the focus and resources dedicated to distant coastal or overseas ventures. Economic changes within Aksum could also have played a role. While trade was vital, the kingdom also relied on agriculture, particularly around its heartland. Changes in climate or environmental degradation, even subtle ones over time, could impact food production and resource availability, putting strain on the state's ability to fund extensive military operations or maintain distant garrisons. Imagine trying to send supplies across the Red Sea when harvests back home are poor because the rains didn't come. Tough choices have to be made. Another factor to consider is the broader geopolitical landscape. While Aksum was allied with Byzantium, the Byzantines were constantly engaged in their own struggles with the Sasanian Empire further north along their shared border in the Levant and Mesopotamia. Byzantine resources were stretched thin, and they may not have been able or willing to provide significant military assistance to Aksum in defending South Arabia, especially if it risked escalating the conflict with the Sasanians into a full-blown multi-front war. Aksum was a useful ally, but perhaps not the absolute top priority when the Sasanians were knocking on Constantinople's metaphorical door. The loss of South Arabia wasn't necessarily a sudden collapse for Axum, but rather the most visible symptom of changing dynamics and perhaps weakening capacity. It marked the end of Axum's most ambitious period of overseas expansion and direct imperial rule in a foreign land. The focus began to shift back towards their East African core territories, consolidating power within the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and maintaining control over the vital trade routes connecting the interior to the Red Sea ports they still controlled like a Adulis. For a quirky tidbit from this transitional period, consider the sheer resilience of trade routes themselves. Even as political control shifted from Axum to Sasanian hands in South Arabia, trade didn't just stop. Goods continued to flow, albeit under different political oversight and potentially through slightly altered channels or networks. Merchants, ever practical, adapted to the new reality. It's like the ancient equivalent of your favorite online store changing ownership. You might grumble, but you still need that thing they sell, so you keep buying. The flow of commerce often finds a way navigating around political turbulence, like water flowing around rocks. The Sasanian victory in Himyar also set the stage for future developments in the Arabian Peninsula. Sasanian influence extended across parts of Arabia, creating a new power dynamic just decades before the rise of Islam would fundamentally alter the region. Axum, while losing its direct foothold in South Arabia, still maintained contact with parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and its legacy, particularly its Christian faith and political presence, remained known. The story of Abraha's elephants, even if embellished, lived on in Arabian memory. Historians still argue whether the Sasanian conquest was the primary cause of Axum's eventual long-term decline or merely an acceleration of existing internal vulnerabilities. Was Axum already overstretched and the Sasanian intervention just delivered the final push in South Arabia? Or was the loss of such a vital economic and strategic asset the main factor that triggered a cascading decline? It's a classic chicken and egg problem in historical analysis, sifting through limited evidence to understand complex causation. You can spend hours in dusty archives or modern databases reading different interpretations and still feel like you're only seeing part of the picture. The kingdom didn't vanish overnight after losing South Arabia. Axum remained a significant regional power for centuries, but the period of its greatest territorial expansion and military reach across the sea had passed. The later history of Axum involves consolidating control in the highlands, interacting with the emerging Islamic world, and adapting to new trade patterns and political realities. But the early to mid-6th century, with the peak under Caleb and the subsequent loss of South Arabia to the Sasanians, represents a turning point, the high water mark receding from the distant shores it had briefly claimed. You can almost feel the shift in the wind, the energy draining from the coastal ports as the focus shifts inland, the grand overseas adventure drawing to a close. So the dream of an Axumite empire stretching across the Red Sea had faded. The Sasanians were now calling the shots in South Arabia, sitting right there on the other side of that narrow strip of water that had once felt like an Axumite bathtub. You could almost hear the collective sigh from the royal court back in Axum, or maybe just the gentle lapping of waves on the shores of Adulis, sounding a bit less triumphant than before. But here's the thing about Axum: it wasn't just a coastal power or even just a Red Sea power. Its heart, its historical roots were deep in the Ethiopian highlands. The loss of South Arabia meant a strategic withdrawal, a refocusing of energy and resources back towards the core. Imagine you're standing in the bustling port of Adulis during this period. The Sasanian flags might be flying across the sea, but here it's still Axumite territory. Ships from Egypt, India, and even further east might still dock. But perhaps the mix is changing, the goods different, the merchants a bit warier, or dealing with new political complexities. You see porters loading ivory tusks, rhinoceros horns. Sadly, yes, that was a thing, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The classic Axumite exports that had made the kingdom rich for centuries. The trade didn't stop dead, it adapted. Axum still controlled the flow of goods from the rich interior to the Red Sea and vice versa. They still had their network of roads connecting the port to the highland cities like Axum itself. Think of it as losing a major international distribution center, but still owning the main factory and the domestic transport network. You take a hit, but you're far from out of business. The capital city of Axum in the highlands remained the center of political and religious life. This is where the king ruled, where the massive stelae, those carved stone giants we talked about earlier, remember stood as silent sentinels to past glory, and where churches were built reflecting the kingdom's deep Christian identity. While the coastal areas felt the direct impact of shifting Red Sea politics, the highlands offered a degree of insulation, a stable base rooted in agriculture and control over the sources of valuable trade goods. You'd find farmers tilling fertile fields, priests conducting services in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language, and artisans crafting gold ornaments and metalwork. It was life going on anchored by tradition and the bounty of the land. This period, roughly from the late 6th century onwards, sees Axum consolidating its power inland. While Adulis remained crucial, the focus might have subtly shifted towards strengthening control over the interior provinces, securing trade routes leading to the coast, and perhaps developing new agricultural lands or resource extraction sites further inland. It's like a company that scales back its international branches to focus on its core domestic market, strengthening its foundations at home. Less glamour perhaps, but necessary for long-term survival. And survival became a key theme, especially as a new seismic shift occurred in the region, the rise of Islam. In the early 7th century across the Red Sea in Arabia, the world as they knew it began to transform rapidly. Within a few decades, the nascent Islamic Caliphate exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula, conquering vast territories that had previously belonged to the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Suddenly, Aksum, this ancient Christian kingdom, found itself increasingly surrounded by powerful, dynamic, and rapidly expanding Muslim states. Egypt fell to the Arab armies, the Levant, Persia. The geopolitical map was being redrawn at lightning speed. How did Aksum navigate this new world order? Surprisingly, for a long time, the relationship between Aksum and the early Islamic powers was remarkably peaceful. This isn't what you might initially expect when you picture a Christian kingdom next to expanding Muslim empire. Right, no epic, immediate clash of civilizations here, at least not on the scale seen elsewhere. There's a mainstream historical fact often cited here. Tradition holds that the Prophet Muhammad himself instructed his early followers, who were facing persecution in Mecca, to seek refuge in Aksum. This event, known as the First Hijra, or migration to Abyssinia. Abyssinia, being a historical name for the region and kingdom, is a significant event in early Islamic history and is mentioned in various Islamic sources. The Negus the Aksumite king at the time, sometimes identified as Arma or Ashama, is said to have offered them protection, refusing demands from Meccan envoys to hand them over. This act of sheltering early Muslims created a degree of goodwill that seems to have lasted for generations. While details are scarce in Aksumite sources, they weren't writing lengthy chronicles about Arabian politics at this point. Later Islamic histories and traditions speak positively of the Negus and his protection of the refugees. This historical interaction, whether embellished over time or not, appears to have set a precedent for relatively peaceful coexistence, at least initially. It's like getting a golden ticket because your ancestor did someone a huge favor way back when. Oh, you're from Aksum. Yeah, your king looked out for us back in the day. You're all right. Trade continued between Aksum and the new Islamic states controlling Egypt and the Arabian coast. Aksumite goods still flowed north and east, and products from the wider Islamic world found their way to Adulis and into the Aksumite interior. Merchants navigated the political boundaries driven by the universal language of commerce profit. Gold, ivory, and slaves, unfortunately, still a sad part of ancient trade economies, went out. Textiles, spices, glass, and other manufactured goods came in. The ports like Adulis remained crucial nodes in these reconfigured trade networks, though their ultimate prosperity was now tied to the policies and stability of their new, powerful neighbors. However, this wasn't a completely friction-free relationship. There were periods of tension, particularly over control of Red Sea islands or coastal territories that were vital for trade security. Later centuries saw more direct conflicts, but the initial period after the rise of Islam is marked more by cautious coexistence and mutual recognition, perhaps aided by that early goodwill gesture and the fact that Aksum, in its highland stronghold, wasn't an immediate existential threat to the rapidly expanding caliphates compared to the crumbling Byzantine and Sasanian empires. They weren't competing for the same core territories, at least not yet. It was more like two neighbors giving each other a wide berth after one suddenly built a massive wall around their property. Aksum's internal structure during this period likely continued its evolution. The king remained the central figure, supported by a court regional governors in the church hierarchy. Christianity was deeply ingrained in the kingdom's identity and culture. Churches continued to be built religious texts, translated and copied. The kingdom wasn't just a political entity. It was a distinct Christian civilization in a region increasingly dominated by Islam. This faith became a crucial anchor, a unifying force, and a marker of their unique identity that would endure through centuries of pressure and isolation. A quirky tidbit from this era, the Aksumites were renowned for their gold coinage, which circulated widely in the Red Sea, and even reached places like India and the Byzantine Empire. But as the Islamic world developed its own sophisticated monetary system, the gold dinar Aksumite coinage gradually changed. It became less prominent internationally, and sometimes the purity or weight might have fluctuated over time, reflecting changing economic conditions or access to gold sources. You can see this change in the surviving coins, a tangible sign of Aksum's economic fortunes shifting and its place in the global trade hierarchy adjusting. It's like checking the expiry date on your favorite currency. Things change. The shift away from the coast, while perhaps initially triggered by the loss of South Arabia, and the new geopolitical landscape also hints at longer-term internal processes. Historians still argue whether the eventual decline of Aksum's coastal power and the later movement of the political center further south into the Ethiopian highlands was primarily due to external pressures like the rise of Islam disrupting trade, or putting military pressure on Adulis, or internal factors like environmental changes, soil exhaustion, shifting population centers, or internal power struggles. Was it the relentless pressure from the outside, or was the kingdom already pivoting inland for different reasons? Was Adulis slowly becoming less viable as a port, or was the attraction of the southern highlands simply growing stronger? It's another one of those historical puzzles where the evidence whispers rather than shouts its answers. Life in the Aksumite heartland during this time wasn't just about kings and trade. You'd still have village life farmers in the fields growing teff, a staple grain that's still key to Ethiopian cuisine today. Seriously, Inyera is amazing herders with their livestock and local markets, where people traded goods, gossip, and perhaps news filtering in from the coast or the distant lands across the sea. The rhythm of life tied to the seasons and religious festivals continued. The grand narratives of empires rising and falling played out in the background of countless ordinary lives. While Aksum maintained its independence and its Christian faith, the increasing dominance of Islamic powers around the Red Sea and in Egypt did have consequences. Aksum became more geographically isolated from other major Christian centers like Byzantium. Communication and travel became more challenging. This isolation, while perhaps contributing to the unique development of Ethiopian Christianity, also meant less access to outside knowledge, technology, and political support. The kingdom became increasingly a Christian island in a Muslim sea, a description often used which, while perhaps a bit dramatic, captures the reality of its position. This period isn't filled with the grand dramatic invasions of Caleb's era, but it's crucial for understanding Aksum's longevity. They didn't collapse when they lost their overseas territories. They adapted, they refocused, they navigated complex relationships with powerful new neighbors. They relied on their core strengths, their agricultural base, their control over interior resources, their existing trade networks, and their deep-rooted Christian identity. It's a story of resilience, of finding a way to survive and even thrive in a radically changed world. You could argue that this quiet period of consolidation laid the groundwork for the later Ethiopian kingdoms that would continue the Aksumite legacy, even as Aksum city itself eventually faded from the center stage. It's like taking your super successful global company and turning it into a really strong, stable national one. Different scale, different challenges, but still a significant player. Imagine the Aksumite king sitting in his palace, perhaps looking at maps, if they had maps, anything like ours, which they definitely didn't. But humor me, he's no longer planning invasions across the Red Sea. He's thinking about securing the trade routes within his kingdom, negotiating with merchants from Egypt now controlled by Arabs, maybe receiving envoys from the distant south or the desert fringes. His world has shrunk geographically in terms of direct rule, but the challenges remain immense, maintaining stability, ensuring prosperity and preserving the kingdom's unique identity in a rapidly evolving regional landscape. This wasn't a time of flashy expansion, but of crucial adaptation and endurance. So you've seen Aksum pivot, tucking itself back into its highland stronghold, leaning into its agricultural wealth and its control of inland resources after the Red Sea became a much more complicated neighborhood. That initial period after the rise of Islam saw a surprising amount of peace. Remember that goodwill from sheltering early Muslims? It seemed to buy them some time a buffer zone against the explosive expansion happening all around them. But goodwill, bless its well-meaning heart, isn't infinite, and geopolitical realities have a nasty habit of catching up. While direct large-scale invasions weren't the immediate story, the pressures mounted. Imagine being that Christian island we talked about, surrounded by seas that are increasingly under the control of powerful new states that, while not necessarily hostile at first, certainly had different priorities and trade networks. The old Red Sea trade routes, which had been Aksum's highway to wealth for centuries, didn't vanish, but they changed. Islamic merchants and polities increasingly dominated the ports on the Arabian and African sides, north of Aksum's traditional territory. Adulis, that bustling port city where you once imagined mountains of ivory and gold being loaded onto ships bound for distant lands, started to fade. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe, probably more of a slow creeping decline. Fewer ships might call there, or the volume of trade decreased, or perhaps the control over the trade shifted into different hands further up the coast. Think of it like a once prime shopping mall gradually losing anchor stores and foot traffic as new bigger malls open up elsewhere. The lights dim, the shops get dustier, the energy slowly drains away. Why did this happen? Well, it's multifaceted, as history often is. External pressure from competing ports and trade networks controlled by increasingly powerful Islamic states definitely played a role, but there might also have been internal factors. Was the area around Adulis becoming less fertile, perhaps due to environmental changes or overexploitation? Were there shifts in the availability or routes of the precious goods, ivory, gold, frankincense, coming from the interior? As the sources of these goods might have shifted further south, perhaps the most efficient trade routes also began to bypass Aksum's traditional port. This decline of Adulis and the increasing difficulty in accessing the Red Sea trade directly likely put significant economic strain on the Aksumite kingdom. Coins, the shiny symbols of international trade and royal power, start to become less common or change in quality, which is a mainstream historical fact gleaned from archaeological finds. We have fewer gold coins minted in later periods, and sometimes the silver or copper issues are of lower quality or variable weight. This isn't just about pocket change. It's a sign of economic struggle, potentially dwindling access to precious metals, or a shift away from a cash-based international economy towards more localized, perhaps barter-based trade networks. The kingdom's center of gravity began a slow, almost imperceptible shift southward. It wasn't a planned move overnight. It was more like a natural migration following the resources following populations, or perhaps moving away from the areas most vulnerable to external pressure. The rich agricultural lands and sources of gold lay further inland, further south in the Ethiopian plateau. As the coastal economy waned, the importance of these interior regions grew. The king might still reside in Aksum City for a time, maintaining the connection to the ancient heartland and the legitimacy of the stelae and old palaces, but real power and economic vitality were starting to flow elsewhere. This period, stretching roughly from the 7th or 8th century onwards, is often frustratingly vague in the historical record compared to the earlier, more glorious Aksumite peak. It's sometimes referred to as a dark age by historians, not because nothing was happening, but because we have fewer inscriptions, fewer coins, and fewer external accounts detailing what was going on. It's like the historical spotlight dimmed, focusing on other regions while Aksum quietly grappled with its transformation. You can imagine the royal scribes maybe not having as much cause to boast fewer foreign dignitaries to impress with monumental inscriptions. Life went on, but perhaps with less fanfare, less grand pronouncements carved in stone. We know that Christianity remained central to Aksumite identity. Churches continued to be built, and the faith was spreading further into the southern regions of the plateau. The clergy played an increasingly important role, not just spiritually, but perhaps also in administering territories and maintaining connections between distant parts of the kingdom as centralized power potentially became less effective over vast distances. The Ge'ez language continued as the language of scripture, and the elite preserving a link to the classical Aksumite, passed even as local languages were spoken in different regions. But the kingdom as a unified centralized entity, spanning from the coast deep into the interior, with a strong international presence centered on Adulis and Aksum city, began to fragment or transform. Local chiefs and regional governors in the more distant southern territories may have become more autonomous. The power of the king in Aksum might have become more symbolic in some areas, while real authority resided with local potentates. There are legends from later periods that try to explain Aksum's decline, often involving dramatic events or figures. One such legend tells of a powerful, possibly pagan or Jewish queen from the south, sometimes called Gudit or Yodit Judith, who devastated Aksum, burned churches, and even destroyed the Stele fields. Though archaeological evidence suggests the Stele fell over time, or were pulled down not necessarily by a single destructive figure. This legend, while likely not historically accurate as a single event, might reflect a period of real turmoil, internal strife, or challenges to Aksumite authority emanating from the southern regions or from groups resisting Christian rule. It's a quirky tidbit, the kind of dramatic story people tell to explain something complex, like blaming all your computer problems on a single mythical virus instead of years of neglecting updates. So was Aksum defeated by external enemies, slowly choked by the changing dynamics of the Red Sea trade controlled by Islamic neighbors? Or did it decline primarily due to internal weaknesses, environmental stress, economic problems, political fragmentation, or challenges from internal or southern groups? Historians still argue whether the primary cause of Aksum's decline was external pressure or internal factors. It's probably a mix, isn't it? External challenges exacerbated existing internal vulnerabilities, and internal shifts made the kingdom less capable of responding to external threats. The changing trade routes weakened the traditional centers, while the wealth and population were shifting south anyway, leading to a gradual reorientation rather than an outright collapse. Imagine you're a merchant in, say, the 9th or 10th century. You might still go to Adulis, but it's not the same. The harbor isn't as full, the selection isn't as diverse, the prices might be higher or lower, depending on who's controlling things further north. You might find yourself traveling further south inland, dealing with different regional rulers who control access to gold or other resources. The established network is fracturing, and you have to navigate a more complex, less predictable landscape. The king in Aksum city still matters perhaps as a figurehead or religious leader, but his reach might not be what it once was. This period is confusing because the sources dwindle. We don't have those detailed royal inscriptions boasting of conquests or building projects. We mostly rely on scattered mentions in later Islamic or European texts, archaeological evidence, and later Ethiopian traditions that often blend history with legend. It's like trying to piece together a family history from faded photographs and contradictory stories told by elderly relatives. You get glimpses, hints, but no clear continuous narrative. What is clear is that the political and economic center of the Ethiopian state began to move southwards away from the historical Aksumite heartland. The dynasty that eventually emerged in the south, the Zagwe dynasty, which ruled from around the 12th century, traced its origins to a different power base centered in what is now the Lasta region. While they revered Aksum and claimed lineage, they represented a distinct phase geographically and politically removed from the ancient Aksumite core. This transition wasn't clean. There wasn't a single fall of Aksum like the fall of Rome. It was more of a long, slow transformation, a shifting of power and focus. The kingdom didn't disappear. It evolved, decentralized, and eventually the center of power relocated. The old capital, Aksum, remained a significant religious and historical site, holding the ancient regalia and serving as a place of coronation for later rulers, even those from new dynasties. It retained immense symbolic importance, even as it lost its status as the primary political and economic hub. Think of a large river delta. The main channel might shift over time due to silting or other factors. The old channel doesn't vanish, but the bulk of the water, the main flow, finds a new path. Aksum city was like the old channel. Still there, still connected, but the main flow of royal power and economic activity was rerouting further south. The challenges posed by surrounding Islamic states weren't just about trade disruption. There could have been skirmishes, raids, and a constant low level of tension along the borders, particularly in coastal areas or frontier regions. Maintaining a strong military presence across a large, increasingly fragmented kingdom would have been costly and difficult. A mainstream historical fact about this period's struggles, the Aksumite control over the trade routes bringing gold and other goods from the deep interior, became increasingly vital as Red Sea trade declined. The ability to project power southward to secure these resources was crucial, and the shifting location of resources, or the rise of new power centers along these routes, likely influenced the southward shift of the kingdom's focus. It wasn't just about getting to the sea anymore, it was about controlling the source. This slow transformation wasn't necessarily a time of complete chaos everywhere, though some regions might have experienced significant instability. In the areas where power consolidated further south, new infrastructure was built, churches were carved directly into rock, a hallmark of the later Zagwe period, famously at Lalibela, and unique forms of Ethiopian Christian culture flourished, drawing heavily on Aksumite traditions, but developing in new ways. So while the grand Aksumite Empire of Caleb's time faded, the Ethiopian state, its culture, and its unique form of Christianity persisted. They adapted to isolation, navigated complex regional politics, and underwent an internal reorientation that would lay the groundwork for later medieval Ethiopian kingdoms. This wasn't the end, but a profound change, a transition from the classical, internationally facing Aksumite kingdom to the more internally focused, isolated, but deeply rooted Christian kingdom of the Ethiopian plateau. It's like your favorite band changing their sound dramatically after losing a key member and moving to a different country. Still the same name, same roots, but a completely different vibe. So the river delta shifted the main channel, finding a new path south, away from the silting shores of the old Aksumite heartland. While Aksum City remained a sacred symbolic place, perhaps you can imagine the empty Stele field whispering tales of a bygone era, the ruins of palaces standing silent against the breeze. The center of political gravity definitely wasn't there anymore. Power wasn't just decentralizing, it was consolidating in a new region, a new dynasty taking the reins. Enter the Zagwe dynasty. These rulers emerged around the 12th century, establishing their capital further south in the Lasta region, roughly where the modern town of Lalibela stands. They represented the culmination of that long, slow southward shift you've been following. Geographically, they were much more securely positioned within the highland plateau, further insulated from coastal pressures and more directly connected to the rich agricultural lands and gold sources of the interior. Now the Zagwe were keen to link themselves to the Aksumite legacy. They weren't just some random new guys who showed up and took over. They presented themselves as legitimate rulers, inheritors of the ancient kingdom, even if their lineage wasn't a direct, unbroken paternal line from the Aksumite kings like Azana or Caleb. Historians still argue whether the Zagwe truly had a blood connection to the Aksumite royal house, or if they were local rulers from the Ago ethnic group who rose to prominence during the period of Aksumite fragmentation and then strategically claimed legitimacy by tying themselves to the Aksumite past and crucially to Aksumite Christianity. Think of it like a company rebranding. Same core product, new logo, slightly different management team, but they really want you to know they're connected to that original respected founder. This connection to Aksumite Christianity was paramount. The Zagwe kings were devout Christians. In a region increasingly surrounded by non-Christian neighbors, Christianity wasn't just a religion. It was a defining feature of identity, a link back to the glorious independent past of Aksum, and a crucial factor in maintaining internal cohesion. The Zagwe saw themselves as protectors of the faith, carrying the torch that Aksum had lit centuries before. Their reign, spanning roughly from the early 12th to the late 13th century, is often seen as a period of consolidation and inward focus. Isolated from the wider Christian world by geographical barriers in the changing political landscape of the Middle East and North Africa, Ethiopia developed its own unique cultural and religious traditions. They weren't forgotten by Christendom entirely. There were still some contacts, particularly with the Coptic Church in Egypt, which traditionally provided the head of the Ethiopian Church. But they were certainly operating on their own terms without the easy access to Red Sea trade or the direct diplomatic ties that the peak Aksumites had enjoyed. And in this period of isolation, the Zagwe achieved something absolutely extraordinary, something that stands today as their most famous legacy and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. Imagine for a moment deciding not to build a church upwards from the ground, but to carve it downwards into the living rock. This is not construction, it is sculpture on a monumental scale. You stand on the edge of a deep trench looking down, and there below you, entirely separated from the surrounding bedrock, stands a complete church. Roof walls, windows, doors, all carved out of the solid stone. You walk through narrow, sometimes underground passages and tunnels, connecting these structures, feeling the cool, smooth stone beneath your fingertips, the air thick with the scent of ancient incense and damp earth. The most famous site has 11 churches grouped into 3 clusters connected by ceremonial passages. Legend attributes their creation to King Lalibela, who reigned in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The sheer scale of the undertaking is staggering. It wasn't just digging out the interior space, it was excavating a trench all the way around the block of rock first, then meticulously carving the exterior facade downwards before finally hollowing out the inside. This would have required incredible planning, immense labor, and sophisticated knowledge of stone carving and drainage to prevent the structures from collapsing or flooding. Why do this? Why choose the hardest possible way to build a church? There are several theories. One is practicality. The local tufa rock is relatively soft, initially making it workable, but hardens on exposure to air. Another is symbolism. Cut from the living rock, the churches could be seen as more enduring, less vulnerable to fire or invasion than conventional buildings. But perhaps the most compelling reason ties back to that isolation and the Zagwe's religious devotion. These churches were intended to be a New Jerusalem, Ekfarainaran, with the Holy Land often inaccessible to pilgrims due to political instability and conflict. The Zagwe kings, particularly Lalibela, sought to create a sacred landscape within Ethiopia itself. The churches were laid out and named to replicate key sites in Jerusalem and the Holy Land. There's a replica of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, symbolic representations of the Jordan River, a trench carved between 2 church complexes, and even references to biblical mountains. Walking through the site, you are meant to feel like you are undertaking a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, experiencing its sacred geography without leaving Ethiopia. It's an incredible testament to the spiritual energy and vision of the Zagwe period, a defiant declaration of faith etched into the very landscape. The most iconic of these churches is Beata Georgis, the House of St. George. Unlike the others, which are carved into the side of a slope or a large pit, Beata Georgis stands alone in a deep square courtyard, carved in the shape of a Greek cross. You approach it through a tunnel and suddenly emerge into the trench surrounding it, looking up at its perfectly formed cruciform shape rising from the earth. It's breathtaking, a genuine architectural marvel. The level of precision, the sharp edges, the intricate details carved into the facade and interior, it makes you scratch your head and wonder how they did it with the tools they had. Legend, which often intertwines with history in these periods, offers a more magical explanation. It's said that King Lalibela was aided in the carving by angels who worked tirelessly alongside the human laborers, perhaps even doubling the work done during the day by continuing through the night. This is a classic quirky or fringe tidbit, the kind of story that speaks to the seemingly impossible nature of the task and the deep faith that motivated it. While logically you know it was skilled human hands and immense effort standing there, looking at Beata Georgis carved out of solid rock, you can almost feel the presence of something extraordinary. The interiors of the churches, while less ornate than some European cathedrals, are powerful in their simplicity. Carved pillars support vaulted ceilings, light filters in through narrow cross-shaped windows, illuminating ancient murals and religious iconography. The acoustics are often resonant, amplifying the chants and prayers of the priests. They are places designed for worship, deeply spiritual and introspective. The creation of these churches is a mainstream historical fact and a major marker of the Zagwe period. It demonstrates the dynasty's wealth, organizational capacity, and fervent religious devotion. It's also a powerful symbol of the continuity of Ethiopian Christian culture, adapting and expressing itself in unique and monumental ways, despite the challenges of isolation and changing geopolitical fortunes. Historians still argue whether the entire complex was completed during King Lalibela's reign, or if construction spanned a longer period under several kings. They also debate the precise sequence in which the churches were carved and the specific symbolic meanings intended for each structure and passage. The lack of extensive written records from the time means we rely heavily on archaeological evidence and later interpretations. The Zagwe kings oversaw a realm that was probably smaller and less outwardly oriented than the peak Aksumite Empire. Their focus was consolidating control in the Central Highlands and nurturing their unique Christian culture. They maintained contact with Egypt, receiving their Aben head of the church from the Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria, a practice that would continue for centuries. This link was vital for maintaining the legitimacy and doctrinal purity of the Ethiopian church in the eyes of the wider Christian world, or at least the part of it they were still connected to. While the Zagwe period is synonymous with the rock-hewn churches, their rule wasn't solely defined by monumental architecture. They administered justice, collected taxes, and maintained order within their kingdom. However, compared to the Aksumite period, with its coin minting and international trade, the Zagwe era appears to have been more focused on internal development and religious life. The Zagwe legacy is complex. On the one hand, they presided over a period of relative isolation and shrinking international ties compared to Aksum's heyday. On the other hand, they were the stewards who preserved and deepened the Christian faith in the highlands during a challenging time and created architectural wonders that remain a core part of Ethiopia's identity. They took the torch from Aksum and carried it forward, albeit along a different path. Their reign wasn't without internal challenges or external pressures, but they managed to maintain a stable kingdom for over a century. They were eventually succeeded by the so-called Solomonic dynasty in the late 13th century, who claimed direct lineage from the ancient Aksumite kings, and more importantly from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This transition marks another significant turning point, moving the capital again further south and ushering in a new era for the Ethiopian state. But before that, before the Solomonic restoration, you have the Zagwe carving their faith into the living rock. Imagine the sound of hammers and chisels echoing in those deep pits, the dust rising, the sheer human will required to turn a mountain into a church. It's a powerful image, a testament to resilience and devotion forged in isolation. It reminds you that even when empires fade and trade routes shift, culture and belief can find new, extraordinary ways to express themselves. You're standing there, the ghosts of Dimpt fading around you like mist in the morning sun. We talked about their stone temples and those few names scratched onto rock like Elemen. But then around the 5th century BCE, or perhaps a bit earlier, it gets quiet. Really quiet. The inscriptions dwindle, the large-scale construction projects seem to halt, and it's like the historical microphone gets dropped in the dirt and stops broadcasting. What follows are centuries of what historians sometimes call the pre-Aksumite period, or more dramatically, a kind of dark age. It's not dark because terrible things necessarily happened, though life was probably tough. It's dark because we can't see clearly what was going on. The lights got turned off, historically speaking. Imagine trying to follow a story where someone rips out 100 pages right in the middle. That's a bit like studying this period. You have the DM kingdom hints of centralization and connections, and then you have the later Aksumite kingdom, which is much better documented with its coinage, monumental stelae, and written records. But what happened in between for roughly 500 or 600 years, from maybe the 5th century BCE to the 1st century CE? The picture becomes incredibly fuzzy. The outline bullet mentioned fragmentation, and that's exactly what the limited evidence suggests. Instead of one dominant power center like Yehab, it seems the region broke up into smaller, more localized entities. Think of it less like a kingdom with a king, and more like a patchwork quilt of chiefdoms. Powerful families and competing groups, maybe controlling just a few valleys or strategic hilltops. Life would likely revert to a more local scale. Allegiances might shift frequently. Trade routes, while still existing, might become more dangerous or less consistently controlled. From an archaeological perspective, this period is frustratingly subtle. You're looking at sites, and it's hard to tell which ones were important, which were just ordinary villages, and which, if any, were centers of these smaller local powers. There aren't grand palaces or clearly identifiable administrative buildings from this time. The material culture, the pottery, the tools, the weapons, might not show dramatic changes, making it difficult to date sites precisely within this long interim period. It's the historical equivalent of trying to find your car keys in a messy room at midnight with only a tiny penlight. You know they're somewhere, but good luck pinpointing them. The people living then, the ones who actually experienced this fragmentation, probably didn't think of it as a dark age. They were just living their lives. Plowing fields, tending livestock, trading goods, dealing with local disputes, and perhaps occasionally being rallied by a local strongman for a raid or defense. Their rulers, if you can even call them that in the formal sense, were likely figures of purely local influence. A chief who commanded loyalty in one area might be unknown or considered an enemy just a few miles away. These local rulers, the forgotten leaders of the fragmentation, left almost no trace of their power in the way the Makarabs did, or certainly not in the way the later Aksumite Neguses would. They didn't commission large inscriptions proclaiming their deeds. They didn't build enduring stone monuments to themselves. Their power was probably based on personal charisma, control of resources, and military strength on a much smaller scale. When they died, where were they buried? Probably in local cemeteries and graves that to our modern eyes look much like anyone else's. There's no obvious tumulus or elaborate chamber that screams, "Important person buried here." Consider the challenges for an archaeologist digging a site that dates to this interim period. They might find evidence of settlement, post holes from houses, storage pits, maybe some stone foundations. They'll find pottery shards, tools, and animal bones. But piecing together a political history from that is incredibly difficult. It's like trying to figure out the hierarchy of a large family reunion just by looking at the discarded paper plates and plastic cutlery. Someone sat at the head of the table maybe, but who were they and what did they actually do? One mainstream historical fact about this interim period is that while direct evidence of centralized rule is sparse to non-existent archaeological findings, do indicate continued settlement and agricultural activity in the region previously associated with DMT, as well as the emergence of new settlement patterns further south, particularly in the northern Tigray region of modern Ethiopia, which would become the core area for the rise of Aksum. So people were definitely still there farming and living. The political organization just seems to have devolved. It wasn't a depopulated wasteland, just a historical blind spot for us. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit about this era, while monumental architecture disappeared, there's some scattered archaeological evidence suggesting changes in ritual practices. For instance, some sites from this period show evidence of smaller, less elaborate cultic areas compared to the large temples of Dimt. There are also hints of shifts in burial practices, with some areas showing simple inhumations or cairn burials that lack the distinctive features that might mark an elite. It's like religion and death became more personal, less tied to state-sponsored grandiosity. Or maybe they just got really good at minimalist funerals. Yep, he's dead. Shovel some dirt on him. Done. Efficiency. Historians still argue whether the interim period represents a complete break from the dimmed past, or if certain ruling lineages or traditions persisted on a local level, eventually contributing to the foundation of Aksum. Did the knowledge, skills, and social structures of Dinadi vanish completely? Or did they survive in scattered pockets, like embers, waiting to reignite? The archaeological record doesn't offer a clear answer, leaving room for plenty of academic head-scratching and whiteboard arguments that, let's be honest, are probably more stimulating than trying to figure out what to have for dinner again tonight, but still not exactly edge-of-your-seat stuff. This fragmentation wasn't necessarily a time of total chaos everywhere. Some local areas might have been relatively stable under the control of a strong chief or council, but without overarching authority, conflicts between neighboring groups were likely common. Imagine your modern neighborhood deciding it's an independent nation. Suddenly disputes over property lines turn into international incidents, and the guy with the biggest dog is probably the acting head of state. It brings an energy to the block party. The leaders of these local powers, the unnamed forgotten chiefs and strongmen, were figures of their time and place. Their kingdoms might have been just a few villages. Their power extended only as far as they could enforce it. They dealt with the daily grind of keeping their small communities fed, defending them from rivals, and perhaps engaging in small-scale trade. They probably had a lot of hands-on work, unlike the more removed ceremonial rulers of larger kingdoms. Maybe they even knew the names of everyone they ruled over. Imagine a king who actually knows your mom's name. Revolutionary. These forgotten rulers lost to time, their stories unrecorded. Their burial places unmarked or indistinguishable are perhaps the most truly forgotten of all. They existed in the gaps between the better-known kingdoms, their reigns too brief or too localized to leave a significant mark on the landscape or the historical memory. They are the anonymous bricks in the foundation of what came later, essential but invisible. You stand in this spectral interim land, and it feels quieter than the time of dim, even quieter than the whispers of the deep past. It's the quiet of things not lost but simply never recorded. It's during these centuries of apparent fragmentation that shifts were happening that would eventually lead to the rise of something new and powerful. Perhaps trade routes were consolidating in different ways. Perhaps one of these local powers, through shrewd alliances, military success, or control of a key resource, began to slowly expand its influence. We don't have the narrative details, the names of the chiefs who started this process, the stories of their struggles and triumphs. They are the truly anonymous figures, the rulers of a historical blind spot. You can try to imagine their faces, their daily struggles, the feel of the rough spun cloth they wore, the taste of the local grain they ate, but it's mostly guesswork. They are ghosts in the historical machine, essential for continuity, but utterly untraceable as individuals. The period ends not abruptly but gradually as archaeological evidence starts to point towards increasing complexity and centralization again, but this time in a slightly different location, further to the north and west of Yeha, in the region around modern-day Aksum. The small local powers begin to coalesce, or perhaps one swallowed the others. The subtle shifts of the interim period give way to the early rumblings of a major kingdom. But for these centuries, the rulers were small-scale local and ultimately destined for absolute historical obscurity. Their tombs are simply part of the landscape, indistinguishable from countless others, their power structure dissolved into the earth. You feel the vastness of that anonymity settling over you, quiet and deep. You were just sinking into the quiet anonymity of those forgotten centuries, the time of fragmented local powers, when suddenly the historical picture starts to sharpen again. It's like someone flicked a switch in a dimly lit room, and while the light is still a bit weak at first, you can definitely start to make out shapes, structure, and intent. This is the dawn of the Aksumite kingdom, a name you've probably heard if you know anything about ancient Ethiopia, and the subject of our next few sleepy moments. The outline called this the first glimmerings of a new power and its unique markers. And unique markers it certainly had. The center of gravity for this emerging power wasn't exactly the same place as Old Dem, though there were connections and overlap. Remember Yeha with its big temple Aksum. The city that would become the heart of the kingdom is located further north and slightly west in the central part of what is now the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Think of it as a new capital rising in a slightly different neighborhood, maybe with better access to the main international highway of its day, the Red Sea trade routes. Aksum didn't appear overnight fully formed and ready to conquer the world. Its rise was gradual, likely starting during that fragmented interim period we just explored. Perhaps one of those local powers, maybe one controlling a key location near a trade route or a particularly fertile valley, started to grow stronger than its neighbors. Maybe it formed alliances, won some skirmishes, consolidated its control over a larger area. Over centuries, these small steps added up like someone slowly building a sandcastle grain by grain until it's significantly larger than all the little mounds around it. The leaders of this burgeoning Aksumite power, unlike the anonymous chiefs of the interim, started doing things that grab a historian's attention. They were organizing labor for larger projects, extracting and controlling resources, and crucially engaging with the wider world in a way that left tangible evidence. They were transitioning from local big shots to regional rulers and eventually to kings. One of the most significant signs that a new, more centralized power was consolidating is the introduction of coinage. This is a big deal. Minting coins isn't something a small local chiefdom typically does. It requires a certain level of economic control, administrative capacity, and confidence on the world stage. The Aksumites were one of the very few states in Africa at this time outside of Roman-controlled areas to issue their own currency. Imagine a ruler deciding, you know what? This bartering thing is getting old. Let's make some little metal discs with my face on them. It's a flex, plain and simple. The earliest Aksumite coins appeared in the late 3rd or early 4th century CE. We're talking centuries after the decline of DMT and well into the period when Aksum was clearly on the rise. The very first king whose name we find on these coins is Indubis. Suddenly, after centuries of historical silence regarding rulers, you have a name stamped onto gold, silver, and copper coins. Indubis might not be a household name today, probably not even in most history classrooms, but his coins are a historical landmark. They tell us definitively there was a ruler named Indubis, and he commanded enough resources and authority to mint money. Holding one of these ancient coins or looking at a picture, which is probably more likely unless you happen to have one lying around, is like holding a tiny piece of propaganda in economic history. Early Aksumite coins often depicted the king in profile wearing a distinctive crown or headdress. Sometimes there were symbols like the crescent moon and disc, which might relate to pre-Christian beliefs. The inscriptions were initially in Greek, reflecting Aksum's strong trade ties with the Mediterranean world, particularly the Roman Empire, and later the Byzantine Empire. Imagine the king's advisor saying, "Okay, Indubis, you're looking majestic on this tiny piece of gold. But who's going to read your name? Better use Greek, everyone. Important uses Greek." It's practical marketing ancient style. The introduction of coinage wasn't just about making trade easier, though it certainly helped. It was a declaration of sovereignty and economic power. It signaled to merchants from across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean that Aksum was a stable, organized entity they could do business with. It also helped the central government collect taxes and pay officials or soldiers. It was a tool for state building. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of setting up a central bank and printing your own currency. It means you're playing in the big leagues now. The fact that these early coins were issued in gold, silver, and copper tells us about the sophistication of the Aksumite economy and its engagement in international trade networks. Gold was likely sourced locally or regionally, silver and copper probably imported. The value ratios between the different metals had to be carefully managed, just like central banks do today. It required a certain level of technical skill for the minting process itself, getting the dyes right, controlling the weight and purity of the metal. It wasn't something just anyone could knock up in their backyard forge. One mainstream historical fact about Aksum's rise is that its strategic location was key. Situated on the northern Ethiopian plateau, Aksum controlled vital trade routes linking the Red Sea coast via its port city of Adulis to the interior of Africa. This allowed them to tap into the lucrative trade of goods like ivory, gold, rhinoceros, horned slaves, and exotic animals, while also importing luxury goods like textiles, wine, and precious metals from the Mediterranean and beyond. This control over trade fueled Aksum's wealth and power, enabling the growth of a more complex society and centralized state. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, early Aksumite coins often have a small distinctive symbol in the field, sometimes described as a cross or X shape. It's thought this symbol might have been an early Christian cross, indicating that some connection to Christianity existed even before the famous conversion of King Azana in the 4th century CE. Or it might have been another symbol, entirely its meaning now lost to us. It's one of those little archaeological mysteries. Why put that specific mark there? Was it religious? A mint mark? An ancient smiley face? Probably not the last one, but you never know. Historians love to debate small symbols on old things. And speaking of debates, historians still argue whether the rise of Aksum represents a continuous evolution from the Demd Kingdom, a complete break and new beginning facilitated by different factors like Red Sea trade, gaining prominence, or something in between. Perhaps a ruling elite with some lineage or knowledge from DMT, but establishing a new order in a new center. Did the rulers of Aksum see themselves as heirs to Demd, or were they building something entirely fresh? The evidence is scattered and open to interpretation, leaving plenty of room for academic speculation and conference papers that would absolutely put you to sleep faster than anything I'm saying right now. The shift from the anonymity of the interim period to the visibility of Aksum, marked by coinage and later by inscriptions and monumental architecture, is profound. It's like going from looking at a blurry, faded photograph to a sharp, clear image. We start to get names, dates, and events, albeit sometimes fragmented. The early kings, like Endubis and his successors, weren't just local strongmen. They were increasingly powerful rulers commanding resources and attention both domestically and internationally. Their tombs, the Whispering Tombs, this whole story is loosely based on, started to reflect this new status. While we'll talk more about the truly monumental Aksumite burials later, the very earliest royal graves associated with Aksum's rise would have been a step up from the simple burials of the fragmented period. They would likely involve more elaborate structures, richer grave goods, and perhaps some attempt to mark the burial place of a significant figure. They start to move from guy who lived here to ruler who was important. The appearance of coins with the king's name and image wasn't just for foreign trade. It was also an internal projection of power. It said to the people within the burgeoning kingdom, "This is who is in charge. This is our money. This is our state." It helped create a sense of shared identity and loyalty around the central authority. It's much harder to ignore the king when his face is literally in your pocket, assuming they had pockets, which they probably didn't. Maybe sewn into a pouch. You get the idea. The early Aksumite kings laid the groundwork for the kingdom that would dominate the region for centuries. They consolidated territory, organized the economy, and established relationships with other major powers. They were the rulers who took Aksum from being one of several local powers to the dominant force on the northern plateau, and eventually a recognized player on the international stage. Their legacy isn't just their names on coins, it's the very foundation of one of Africa's great ancient civilizations. You imagine Endubis perhaps deciding on the design for his first coin. What did he want the world and his own people to see his profile looking regal? A powerful symbol, the inscription in Greek to impress the merchants. It's a moment where leadership becomes historically visible, emerging from the long, quiet centuries that came before. The anonymity is lifting, replaced by the faint but clear impression of royal authority, stamped in metal, carrying the first whispers of the Aksumite story. The first glimmers of Aksumite power we saw in the last section, those faint impressions on coins, and the rise of identifiable rulers weren't just a flash in the pan. They were the beginning of a trajectory that led to something truly spectacular. Something that still stands quite literally as a defining feature of ancient Ethiopia. We're talking about the monumental phase of Aksum, the era of giant stelae, the widespread adoption of Christianity, and the kingdom's rise to become one of the major powers of the late antique world. Your sleep journey is now taking you to the peak of Aksumite achievement before the slow, inevitable fade. The outline bullet for this final leg of our drowsy adventure promised we'd explore Aksumite monuments and their eventual decline, touching on the famous stele, the conversion to Christianity, and the fading of the kingdom. And what better place to start than with those colossal stone needles that pierce the Aksumite sky? Imagine standing in the heart of the ancient city of Aksum. Even today, what dominates the landscape are the stele fields. These aren't just markers. They are engineering marvels and artistic statements carved from single blocks of granite. The largest standing one is around 24 meters tall, but the really mind-boggling one, the Great Stele, lies broken on the ground. Had it been successfully erected, it would have towered over 33 meters and weighed something like 500 tons. Think about that for a second. 500 tons. Moving that thing, shaping it, and somehow standing it upright without modern cranes is just nuts. It required immense organization, manpower, and technical skill. It speaks volumes about the power and ambition of the rulers who commissioned them. These stelae aren't just rough-hewn stones. They are intricately carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false doors and windows, even representations of timber beams. It's like they were trying to replicate royal palaces or mansions in stone for eternity. Their primary purpose is generally accepted by historians to have been funerary markers for the tombs of Aksumite royalty and elite. The major stele fields are located near clusters of elaborate underground tombs. So as you drift off, picture these towering stone skyscrapers of the dead guarding the eternal rest of kings and queens. The craftsmanship is incredible. How did they quarry such huge blocks? How did they transport them sometimes over miles from the quarries to the city? And how on earth did they raise them upright? These are questions that still spark awe and some good old-fashioned historical head-scratching. Some theories involve complex systems of levers, ropes, and counterweights, perhaps using massive earth ramps. It's a bit like trying to figure out how the Egyptians built the pyramids or how the builders of Stonehenge got those blue stones across Wales. Lots of educated guesses, probably involving lots of very tired people. Beyond the sheer scale, the stelae also offer glimpses into Aksumite beliefs and society before the arrival of Christianity. Many feature pre-Christian symbols like the disc and crescent motif we saw on early coins. The elaborate carvings suggest a hierarchical society with clear social stratification capable of mobilizing vast resources for monumental projects dedicated to its ruling class. Now let's talk about a turning point, a change that reshaped the religious and political landscape of Aksum forever, the conversion to Christianity. This happened in the 4th century CE, traditionally associated with King Ezana. Ezana is a big name in Aksumite history. You might have heard of him. His reign is documented through some remarkable stone inscriptions written in 3 languages. Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian language; Sabaean, the language of South Arabia, reflecting Aksum's ties across the Red Sea in Greek. These inscriptions found on stelae and other monuments detail Ezana's military campaigns, building projects, and critically his religious beliefs. Early in his reign, Ezana's inscriptions invoke pre-Christian deities like Astar-Beher and Meter. But later inscriptions, often dated to the latter part of his rule, clearly show a shift. They speak of the Lord of Heaven and feature the cross symbol. His coins also change. The old crescent and disc are replaced by the cross. This provides pretty solid evidence for a royal conversion. The story preserved in later Ethiopian tradition and by contemporary Byzantine writers is that 2 Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Aedesius, were shipwrecked on the Aksumite coast. They were brought to the royal court and eventually rose to positions of influence. Frumentius, in particular, became a tutor to the young Ezana. After gaining permission to return home, he traveled to Alexandria and convinced the Patriarch Athanasius to consecrate him as the first bishop of Aksum. Frumentius, known in Ethiopian tradition as Abun Salama, Father of Peace, then returned to Aksum and played a key role in establishing the Christian church. The conversion of the king and court didn't mean the entire population instantly became Christian overnight. It was likely a gradual process that unfolded over centuries, with traditional beliefs coexisting with and sometimes blending into the new faith. However, the royal adoption of Christianity had profound implications. It aligned Aksum with the Byzantine Empire, the dominant Christian power of the Eastern Mediterranean, strengthening diplomatic and trade ties. It also gave the Aksumite state a new ideology and organizational structure through the church, which would become a central institution in Ethiopian history. A mainstream historical fact about this period is that under King Ezana, Aksum not only adopted Christianity, but also expanded its power and influence significantly. Ezana's trilingual inscriptions boast of military victories against neighboring peoples, including the Beja and the Kushites. Aksum controlled territory stretching from the Red Sea coast inland and exercised influence across the Red Sea and parts of South Arabia. At its height, Aksum was a major international player, recognized alongside powers like Rome, Persia, and China. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit related to the stelae. While the massive stelae are the most famous, there are also fields of much smaller undecorated stelae, known as anthropomorphic stelae, because they vaguely resemble human figures. These are found in cemeteries around Aksum and other parts of Ethiopia. They are much older than the large royal stelae, possibly dating back to the late Dempt period or the early Aksumite rise. Their exact meaning and connection to the later giant stelae are unclear, but they suggest a long tradition of using standing stones to mark burials or commemorate people. Imagine walking through a field of these silent ancient figures, each one a forgotten marker for someone who lived and died millennia ago. It's a bit eerie, isn't it? Like a crowd of stone ghosts. And here's where a scholarly debate pops up. Historians still argue whether Aksum's conversion to Christianity was primarily a politically motivated decision, aligning with Byzantium against rivals like Persia, or a genuine spiritual transformation influenced by missionaries like Frumentius. Was Ezana a calculating statesman or a true believer? Probably a bit of both, as is often the case with rulers. The inscriptions certainly have a pragmatic, power-focused tone, even when invoking the Lord of Heaven. But that doesn't necessarily negate genuine faith. It's a classic chicken and egg historical puzzle. Aksum's peak was glorious. They controlled key trade routes, minted gold coins, built impressive monuments, and developed their own writing system, Ge'ez, which is still used today. They intervened militarily across the Red Sea, demonstrating considerable naval power. They were for a time the unchallenged masters of their corner of the world. But kingdoms, like everything else, eventually decline. Aksum's decline wasn't a sudden dramatic collapse like an empire crumbling overnight. It was more of a slow, drawn-out process, a gradual fading from the international stage. Several factors contributed to this. One major factor was the changing landscape of international trade. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE and the subsequent Arab expansion throughout the Middle East and North Africa significantly altered Red Sea trade routes. While Aksum initially maintained relations with the early Islamic world, its control over key ports and trade networks gradually eroded. The center of gravity for global trade shifted, and Aksum found itself increasingly isolated. Environmental factors may have also played a role. Deforestation, soil erosion, and changing rainfall patterns could have put pressure on agriculture, the backbone of the economy, especially as the population grew. Maintaining those massive public works and feeding a large urban population requires a stable and productive environment. There were also likely internal issues, perhaps political instability, succession disputes, or pressure from neighboring groups who grew stronger as Aksum weakened. The core of the Aksumite kingdom eventually retreated from the coast and northern areas, consolidating power further south in the Ethiopian highlands. The great city of Aksum itself gradually declined in importance as a political and economic center, though it remained a crucial religious site due to its association with the conversion to Christianity and the church. The monumental building ceased, the scale of royal burials diminished, and the international visibility faded. So the kingdom of Aksum didn't disappear entirely. It transformed. It became the kernel around which future Ethiopian states and the Ethiopian church were built. The legacy of Aksum, particularly its Christian identity and the Ge'ez language, survived and shaped the course of Ethiopian history for the next 1,000 years and beyond. The royal line eventually shifted and the capital moved south, but the connection to the Aksumite past remains central to Ethiopian identity. The Whispering Tombs, this story is loosely based on those underground chambers beneath the Stele fields, eventually fell silent. The rulers who commissioned them were forgotten by the wider world, their names preserved primarily on coins and inscriptions that lay buried for centuries. The towering stelae stood as silent witnesses to a past glory, slowly weathering under the sun and rain. Our journey through these forgotten layers of history, from the earliest settlements near Yeha to the rise and eventual decline of Aksum, brings us to the close of this particular narrative. We've traced the faint echoes of Dam, navigated the silence of the interim, and witnessed the rise of a powerful kingdom that left its mark in stone and faith. It's a long, complex story full of gaps and mysteries, whispers from the past that we've tried to listen to tonight. The history we've explored tonight stretches back across millennia, a vast tapestry woven with threads that are sometimes bright and clear, sometimes faded and broken. You've walked in your mind's eye through ancient temple courtyards, felt the silence of forgotten tombs, and marveled at the sheer scale of ambition etched in stone. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? All those names, those dates, those shifting sands of time and power. But now, as the story winds down, you don't need to hold on to every detail. Let the specifics soften around the edges. Allow the long sweep of time to wash over you like gentle waves on a shore. The important thing isn't memorizing facts. It's feeling the presence of these past lives, recognizing that civilizations rise and fall, leaving echoes behind. The kings are long gone, their kingdoms transformed or forgotten, but the land remains holding their secrets. The stele still stand silent, sentinels under the stars, whispering stories to the wind. As you settle deeper into your comfort, feel the quiet of the night envelope you. There's nothing more to grasp, nothing left to analyze. Just the slow, steady rhythm of your breath and the calming thought of ancient stones sleeping under an ancient sky. Let yourself drift now, carried away by the peaceful current of time.